There's a place in the desert of southern Iraq where the wind moves over cracked earth and low mounds of sand, and nothing much seems to be there. No walls standing, no towers, no sign that anything important ever happened on that ground. If you walked across it without knowing better, you'd think it was just empty land, the kind of nowhere place that never had a name. But beneath that sand is the memory of a city the ancient Mesopotamians themselves believed was the very first city on Earth. They called it Eridu. Here's the strange part. This wasn't some obscure guess made by modern archaeologists piecing together fragments. The Sumerians themselves, thousands of years ago, looked back at their own history and pointed to Eridu as the place where kingship first descended from the heavens, where civilization itself supposedly began. That's an extraordinary claim for a city that today most people have never even heard of, a city so thoroughly forgotten that it took over a century of digging in the sand just to prove it was ever there at all. So how does a place like that happen? How does a city sacred enough to be named first in the oldest king list humans ever wrote just disappear? Not disappear in a dramatic collapse, not burned to the ground in some final battle we can point to, but disappear the way a name fades from memory, slowly, quietly, until it becomes nothing more than a bump in the desert that archaeologists have to dig into just to remember it existed. Now, before we go further, let's be careful here, because this story deserves careful treatment. Eridu is exceptionally old. That much the archaeological evidence supports. But whether it deserves the title of the actual first city ever built by human beings is more complicated than the ancient texts made it sound. The Sumerians had their reasons for placing Eridu at the beginning of everything, and those reasons were partly religious, partly political, and partly rooted in genuine ancient memory. Untangling fact from sacred storytelling is part of what makes this investigation so fascinating. Over the next while, we're going to dig through all of it together. We'll look at what archaeologists actually found when they excavated Eridu, layer after layer after layer, going back further than almost any other city site on the planet. We'll look at what the ancient texts said about it, the myths, the king lists, the flood stories that seem to circle back to this one location again and again. We'll look at the environment, the rivers, the marshes, the water that made life possible in a landscape that otherwise offered very little. We'll look at the religion built around it, centered on a god of wisdom and deep waters. And eventually we'll look at how and why this sacred ancient place was left behind, buried under centuries of sand, until it became something scholars had to rediscover almost from scratch. Before we get into all of that, I want to know something. Where in the world are you listening to this from, and what time is it right there for you? I love reading through the comments and seeing this strange little snapshot of everyone tuned in together. London at midnight, Sydney at sunrise, someone lying in bed in Ohio unable to sleep. It's a small thing, but it always reminds me how connected we all are, listening to the story of the very first cities from every corner of the modern world. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into ancient history, the best way to support the show is by following on Spotify. Listen there when you can, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right there in the description whenever you're ready. Now let's step into the sand and start uncovering what's actually buried beneath it. So let's slow down for a second, because that phrase, the first city, gets thrown around a lot easier than it should. It sounds simple. It sounds like something you could just look up and confirm. But archaeologists don't actually have a clean, agreed-upon test. You can run on a pile of ancient dirt that spits out yes, city, or no, not yet. What they have instead is a spectrum, and figuring out where any given settlement falls on that spectrum is one of the messiest, most argued about problems in the entire field. Think about what separates a village from a town, and a town from a city. A village is small, self-sufficient, mostly farmers and herders living close to their fields, maybe a few dozen families who all know each other by name. A town starts to specialize a little. You get people who aren't farming full-time, maybe someone making pottery for trade, maybe a small shrine that draws people in from nearby settlements. Then there's the category that trips a lot of people up, the ceremonial centre. This is a place that might not have a huge permanent population at all, but it pulls people in periodically for rituals, for gatherings, for burying the dead or worshipping the gods. Stonehenge is a ceremonial centre. It's not a city, even though enormous effort went into building it. A city, by contrast, needs several things happening at once. A population large enough and dense enough that most people can't just farm their own food. Specialised labour, priests, craftsmen, administrators, people who spend their days doing something other than growing crops. Some kind of organised authority to coordinate all of that, and usually monumental architecture, temples, walls, public buildings that only make sense if there's a workforce and a leadership structure capable of building them and maintaining them. When you're talking about the first true city, you're really asking, when did human beings first pull off all of that at once? Now here's where Eridu gets interesting, and honestly a little strange. The earliest layers at Eridu date back into the Ubaid-period, which stretches back further than most people realise, possibly close to 5400 BCE, and some estimates push the earliest occupation even earlier than that. That's not just old, that's old enough to predate the classic Sumerian civilization most people picture when they think of Mesopotamia by well over 1,000 years. Eridu wasn't built by the Sumerians as we usually imagine them. It was already ancient by the time the civilization we call Sumer had fully formed. In a sense, the Sumerians inherited Eridu rather than founded it. But Eridu isn't alone in claiming deep antiquity, and it's worth being honest about that. Jericho, over in the Jordan Valley, has occupation layers going back further still, into the Natufian and early Neolithic periods, with a stone tower and walls dating to around 8000 BCE. That's genuinely older than anything at Eridu, but Jericho at that stage looks more like a large fortified village or an early town. Not a full urban centre with the kind of specialised labour and monumental religious architecture we associate with cities. Then there's Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, an extraordinary site of densely packed mud brick houses dating to around 7500 BCE, home to thousands of people at its peak. But even Çatalhöyük seems to lack a clear central authority, a palace, an administrative hierarchy. It looks more like an enormous, tightly clustered village than a city with organised governance. And then you have Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, which some archaeologists argue may have urbanised independently and possibly even earlier in some respects than the southern Mesopotamian sites, complicating the whole narrative even further. So when you place Eridu next to these other candidates, you start to see the real picture. Eridu isn't necessarily the single oldest inhabited spot on Earth. It's not the only place with deep, continuous occupation stretching back into deep prehistory. What makes Eridu remarkable is something more specific. It shows an unusually early and unusually clear trajectory, from small settlement to sacred centre to genuine urban complex, with a temple that was rebuilt again and again, on the exact same spot for thousands of years, layer stacked on layer, growing more elaborate with each rebuilding. That continuity is rare, and it's exactly the kind of evidence archaeologists look for when trying to understand how urbanism actually developed, not through some sudden invention, but through a slow accumulation of religious authority, economic organisation and population growth happening together in the same place, generation after generation. This is why Mesopotamia keeps coming up whenever historians talk about the origins of cities. It's not that nothing was happening anywhere else in the world. It's that southern Mesopotamia, and Eridu specifically, gives us one of the clearest, most continuous windows into that transformation. The moment scattered human settlements started becoming something we'd recognize as urban civilization. Whether Eridu deserves the crown of first city outright is still debated, but as a leading candidate, one of the earliest places on Earth where sacred devotion and urban life grew up together from the same muddy ground, it has very few rivals. But to understand what that transformation really meant, we have to get one thing straight. Eridu did not appear in a world called Sumer, not at first. When the earliest people settled there were no cuneiform tablets, no kings with names we can read, no Sumerian city-states competing for canals, farmland, and divine favour, no royal inscriptions declaring that one ruler had conquered another. The world that later generations would call Sumer was still being made, slowly, by people whose names are lost to us. This is the deep past of southern Mesopotamia, a place that did not yet look like the famous land of Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Babylon. It was wetter in some places, unstable in others, cut through by rivers that shifted course over time. Marshes spread across the lowland, reeds grew in enormous stands. Fish, birds, shellfish, grazing animals, and seasonal plants gave people ways to survive even where farming was difficult. And difficult is the key word here. Southern Mesopotamia was not automatically a paradise. The land was fertile, yes, but fertility came with conditions. Rivers flood, channels move, salt can build up in the soil. A field that produces well for one generation can become useless if water is managed badly. And in the far south, rain-fed agriculture was never enough on its own. People had to understand water. They had to work with it, redirect it, store it, move through it, and live beside it without being destroyed by it. That is the world Eridu entered. Archaeologists call much of this long formative era the Ubaid-period. The name comes from Tel al-Ubaidi, another ancient site in southern Iraq, but the culture was much bigger than one settlement. Ubaid communities spread across Mesopotamia between roughly 6,500 and 3,800 BCE, though dates vary by region and by excavation. This was not yet Sumer in the familiar historical sense, but it was the cultural foundation underneath later Sumerian civilization. Think of it like the deep stonework beneath a famous building. Most people notice the palace above ground, the walls, the inscriptions, the kings, the ceremonies. But none of it stands without the foundations below. The Ubaid-period is that foundation. Long before writing recorded the names of Sumerian gods and rulers, people in this region were already building permanent settlements, producing distinctive painted pottery, developing farming systems, managing animals, and creating ritual spaces that would grow more important over time. And they were not all doing the same thing. It is tempting to imagine prehistoric people as either farmers or hunters, settled or nomadic, primitive or civilized. But the reality was much messier and much more interesting. Communities around southern Mesopotamia could farm barley and wheat where conditions allowed. They could herd sheep, goats, and cattle. They could fish the marshes and rivers. They could gather reeds for houses, boats, baskets, mats, and fuel. Some groups likely moved seasonally between grazing grounds, water sources, and cultivated plots. Others remained more permanently settled. Many probably did both, shifting their strategies as rivers moved, rainfall changed, or herds needed new pasture. This was not a population waiting around to invent civilization. These were people already solving difficult problems every day. How do you grow food in a land where too little water means failure, but too much water can wipe out your fields? How do you travel across wetlands with no stone roads? How do you build a house where mud is everywhere, timber is scarce, and the ground itself can turn to sludge after a flood? How do you keep a community together when your landscape never stays still? The answer over centuries was adaptation, mud brick architecture. Boats made from reeds and coated with bitumen, storage practices, animal management, shared labour, local exchange networks, and increasingly temples or communal buildings that may have helped organise ritual life, food redistribution, and collective work. That last part matters because later Mesopotamian civilization did not rise from nowhere. The huge temple institutions of historical Sumer, with priests, offerings, land holdings, labourers, and administrative records, had earlier ancestors. We cannot assume that every Ubaid shrine functioned like a later Sumerian temple that would be reading the future backward into the past. But at places like Eridu, the repeated rebuilding of sacred structures suggests that communal ritual had already become anchored to specific places. People returned to the same ground. They rebuilt, they remembered. And that may be one of the most important things Eridu tells us. Before there were written histories, there was already historical behaviour. Not history in the modern sense, with dates and documents, but a sense that one place mattered because generations before you had made it matter. A shrine built over an older shrine. A house replaced by another house. A settlement becoming more permanent because people invested labour, memory, and belief into the same patch of earth. But now we need to be careful with the phrase before Sumer. It is useful because it reminds us that Eridu's first settlers lived long before Sumerian writing appeared. The earliest known writing in southern Mesopotamia does not emerge until the late 4th millennium BCE, probably around 3400 to 3200 BCE, and it appears most clearly at Uruk, far later than Eridu's earliest occupation layers. The first tablets were not epic poems or histories. They were mostly practical records, goods, rations, animals, workers, quantities. Civilization did not begin when someone wrote a myth. It began at least in part when institutions became complicated enough to need accounting. By then, Eridu was already old. Its earliest Ubaid occupation may reach back close to 5400 BCE, perhaps earlier depending on how the evidence is interpreted. That means there may be something like 1500 years, possibly more, between Eridu's beginnings and the first appearance of writing. 1500 years. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance between the fall of the Roman Empire in the West and the modern world. Imagine trying to compress everything from late Rome to today into one blurry label and calling it all the same civilization. That is what happens when we casually say Eridu was Sumerian from the start. It probably was not, at least not in any way we can demonstrate. We do not know what language Eridu's earliest inhabitants spoke. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know whether they would have recognized the word Sumer or the later identity of the Sumerian-speaking populations who had come to dominate the written record. Archaeology can reveal houses, pottery, tools, bones, canals, temples, and trade. It cannot directly recover a people's language unless writing exists. And at early Eridu writing does not yet exist. So, before Sumer should not mean that one people vanished and another suddenly appeared, as if civilization changed hands overnight. Cultures do not usually work that way. There was continuity. Techniques persisted. Settlement patterns developed gradually. Religious traditions may have preserved very old memories, even as they changed. Later Sumerian cities stood on a landscape shaped by generations of earlier people. But there was change too. New populations may have arrived. Languages shifted, institutions grew more powerful, trade expanded, villages became towns, and some towns became cities. The Sumerians of the written age inherited an ancient world, then transformed it into something larger, more centralized, and more visible to history. That is why Eridu is so unsettling. It sits at the edge of a historical silence. Later Mesopotamian texts would remember it as the first city, the city of Enki, lord of the freshwater deep. They would place it at the beginning of kingship itself, before a great flood changed the world. But the actual mound preserves something even stranger than legend. It preserves evidence of people living there before the names in those stories existed, before the written gods had fixed identities, before kingship could be listed, before Sumer could speak for itself in clay. And yet, the path towards Sumer was already taking shape, not through one dramatic invention, not because a king ordered a city to rise from the mud, but through thousands of ordinary decisions: where to build, when to plant, how to move water, who would gather for ritual, how communities could survive in a landscape that demanded cooperation. Eridu began in that long, almost invisible age, and from that beginning a settlement built beside the waters would start becoming something no human society had ever quite made before. But what did that water world actually look like? Today, Eridu is a low, dusty mound in southern Iraq. Brown earth, salt flats, open sky. The kind of place where, at first glance, it is hard to imagine a city of fishermen, boat builders, farmers, pilgrims and temple workers ever surviving. Harder still to imagine the sea being nearby. But in Eridu's earliest centuries, this landscape may have looked radically different. Picture southern Mesopotamia around the 6th millennium BCE. Not a clean map with fixed rivers and sharp coastlines. Not the modern Iraq you can see from a satellite image. This was a living delta, water moving slowly across an almost perfectly flat plain. Channels splitting apart, silting up, reappearing somewhere else. Marshes expanding in wet years and shrinking in dry ones. Lagoons linked to rivers, reeds stretching toward the horizon. And farther south the waters of the Persian Gulf pushing inland much farther than they do today. Eridu stood in this unstable borderland between river, marsh and sea. Exactly where the ancient shoreline lay is still debated. That is one of the problems with reconstructing Eridu's world. Rivers carry enormous amounts of mud and silt over thousands of years. The Tigris and Euphrates built new land outward into the Gulf. Coastlines changed, channels migrated, wetlands formed and vanished. Sea levels rose and fell. A place that was once close to tidal water may now sit far inland, surrounded by dry ground. So archaeologists cannot simply point at a modern map and say, the coast was here. The ancient geography has to be reconstructed from sediments, old river courses, environmental data, archaeological sites and clues preserved in the landscape itself. And even then, there are uncertainties. But the broad picture is clear enough. Eridu was not founded in an empty desert. It was founded in a watery world that gave its people possibilities that are easy to underestimate. Reeds alone could support an astonishing amount of life. They could be cut and woven into mats, baskets, roofs, fences and walls, bundled into lightweight boats, used as fuel, used as animal fodder. In a region with very little natural timber, reeds were not just plants. They were building material, transport technology, household equipment and survival. Then there was the food. Fish-filled rivers, channels and marsh pools. Waterfowl gathered in wetlands season after season. Shellfish could be collected along shallow waters. Grazing animals came to drink. Wild plants provided seeds, roots and fibre. Herds of sheep, goats and cattle could feed in the margins between marsh and dry land. And cultivated fields where water could be controlled added barley, wheat and other crops to the menu. This was not one resource, it was a whole system. If one source failed, another might still hold. A poor harvest did not necessarily mean there were no fish. A dried channel did not necessarily mean the marsh had disappeared. A flood that damaged one field might leave behind rich silt somewhere else. In a difficult environment, diversity was security. And water made movement easier too. Across flat, muddy country, a boat could do what a road could not. It could carry people, reeds, animals, pottery, grain, and perhaps goods from far beyond the settlement. Later Mesopotamian traditions remembered southern Iraq as a world of canals and boats, and the archaeological evidence suggests water transport had deep roots in the region. Reed boats coated with bitumen were practical, repairable, and perfectly suited to shallow channels. Imagine what that meant for a small settlement. A family living beside a marsh was not isolated just because there were no roads. A narrow waterway could connect them to another village. A lagoon could open toward fishing grounds. A river branch could lead north toward farming communities or south toward the Gulf. The wetlands were not a barrier around Eridu. They were its network. But water was never simply a gift. The alluvial plain offered fertile soil, but it demanded constant attention. Southern Mesopotamia received too little rainfall to depend on rain-fed farming. If people wanted reliable harvests, they had to use river water. They had to guide it into fields, keep it from flooding houses, clear channels when they clogged, and make sure it did not disappear before crops matured. That is irrigation. And irrigation is one of humanity's most powerful inventions because it turns seasonal water into planned food production. But it also creates risks. Take too little water and crops fail. Take too much and fields flood. Let canals break and water can cut through a settlement or vanish into the wrong place. Let irrigation water sit too long in hot ground and salt begins to build up in the soil. The water evaporates, the minerals remain. Over generations, a productive field can become less productive, then nearly useless. This is one of the central facts of Mesopotamian history. The same water that made cities possible could also undermine them. At Eridu, the earliest inhabitants may not have been constructing the vast canal systems known from later periods. We should not imagine engineers with state-sized labour forces appearing overnight. Early water management was probably smaller in scale, adapted to local channels, seasonal flooding, gardens, fields, marsh edges, and natural drainage. But the underlying problem was already there. How do you live from water without being ruled by it? That question would shape Eridu for thousands of years. It shaped where people built on slightly raised ground, where they could stay above the wettest areas. It shaped what they built with: mud brick, reed, clay, bitumen, materials drawn directly from the landscape around them. It shaped their economy: fishing, herding, farming, gathering, transport. It shaped their social life too, because water management is rarely an individual task. A canal needs clearing, a floodbank needs repair, a shared channel needs rules. Somebody has to decide who gets water, when and how much. And once a community starts organising water, labour, storage, and ritual in the same place, something important begins to happen. A settlement becomes harder to leave, not impossible to leave. Rivers move, marshes dry, fields turn salty, disease, conflict, or changing trade routes can push people away. But every house rebuilt, every channel cleared, every burial made, every shrine repaired adds another layer of commitment. The community becomes tied not just to the land, but to a particular relationship with the land. That relationship was always changing. The Gulf shoreline shifted. River channels wandered across the plain. Marshes grew and contracted. Sediment accumulated. Climate varied. What had been a convenient landing place for boats might become shallow mud. What had been marsh could become dry ground. What had been fertile farmland could become salty and exhausted. This is why Eridu's story cannot be told as a simple rise, then fall. Environmental change was not a final disaster waiting at the end of the city's history. It was there from the beginning. It was one of the forces that made Eridu possible, and one of the forces that would repeatedly test it. The city grew because people learned to exploit a watery landscape. But that same landscape never stopped moving beneath them, and that creates a strange contrast. Stand at Eridu now, and you're looking at a place that seems abandoned by water. The reeds are gone, the lagoons are gone, the boats are gone. The gulf is far away. What remains is a mound rising from an arid plain, as if the city had always belonged to dust. But it did not. Under that dry surface lies the memory of channels, marsh resources, tidal waters, and generations of people who understood that water was life. Not metaphorically, literally. Water was food. Water was transport. Water was farmland. Water was danger. Water was sacred power. And at Eridu, long before the written myths named its god, people were already building their lives around that fact. That world is gone now, or almost gone. What survives is Tel Abu Sharayan, the archaeological mound identified with ancient Eridu. The name means the mound of Abu Sharayan, the father of two moons, though the ancient city beneath it was known by another name entirely, Eridu, in Sumerian, Eridug, a place later traditions would remember as the first city, the city of Enki, the place where kingship first came down from heaven. But when modern travellers first encountered the site, they did not find a legendary city. They found a mound, low, broad, weathered by wind and rain, rising only modestly above the plain. No standing palace walls, no towering temple visible from miles away. No streets full of people, just hardened earth, broken pottery, scattered brick, and the faint outlines of structures almost erased by time. That is one of archaeology's strangest lessons. Ancient cities do not always survive as cities. Sometimes they survive as hills, and those hills have a name. A tell. A tell is not a natural mound. It is history piled on top of itself. In southern Mesopotamia, houses were often built from mud brick. Mud, water, straw shaped into bricks and dried in the sun. It was cheap, practical, and made from materials people could find almost everywhere. But mud brick does not last forever. Rain softens it. Wind cuts into it. Floodwater undermines it. Walls crack. Roofs collapse. Floors become buried beneath dust and debris. So people rebuilt. A family repaired a wall, then rebuilt the room, then raised the floor because the old one had become damp or uneven. A later generation built over the earlier house. A shrine was enlarged. A platform was raised. A new building went up where an old one had crumbled. Century after century, the settlement slowly climbed upward. The earliest village ended up beneath later houses. Those houses ended up beneath later temples. The temples ended up beneath more construction. And eventually, after the city was abandoned, the ruins eroded into a mound. That is Tel Abu Sharain, not one Eridu. Many Eridus stacked on top of each other. And that created both an extraordinary opportunity and a terrible problem. Because if archaeologists can dig down through the mound layer by layer, they can move backward through time. They can find later buildings, then earlier ones, then earlier still. They can trace how a settlement changed, how rooms were arranged, how pottery styles shifted, how temples grew, how people altered the ground beneath their feet. But every layer is fragile, every trench is destructive. Once a mud brick wall has been exposed, it begins to weather. Once a layer has been removed, it can never be put back exactly as it was. Excavation is not like opening a book and turning pages. It is more like reading a book while carefully cutting each page away. And at Eridu the book was already damaged before archaeologists arrived. Wind had worn down the upper levels, rain had washed material across slopes, salt in the soil had attacked ancient brick, burrowing animals disturbed layers. Later activity altered parts of the mound, groundwater complicated excavation, especially in the lower levels where some of the oldest remains lay close to the water table. Then there was the simple fact that Eridu was enormous in time. The site was occupied, transformed, remembered, and revisited across millennia. A trench can reveal one part of that story in remarkable detail, while missing another part completely. A building may survive in one area but be gone in another. A wall may look like the beginning of a structure when it is actually the final rebuild of something much older. Archaeology gives us evidence. It does not give us a perfect replay. The modern rediscovery of Eridu began in the 19th century, when European explorers and officials were moving through southern Iraq, often searching for the great places named in biblical and Mesopotamian tradition. In the 1850s, the British diplomat and excavator J. Taylor investigated Tel Abu Shaurin. Taylor also worked at Ur, another ancient city nearby, and his work helped bring these ruined mounds into the attention of scholars far beyond Mesopotamia. At first, the goal was often simple: identify ancient places, recover inscriptions, find monumental architecture, connect ruined sites to famous names from old texts. But Eridu did not give up its secrets easily. It was not like Nineveh, with huge royal palaces and carved stone reliefs. It was not like Babylon, whose name had echoed through classical and biblical history. Eridu was older, quieter, and built mostly from earth. Its greatest importance was buried deep below later construction. More systematic work in the 20th century began to reveal what Taylor could not have seen. Iraqi archaeologists, working with other researchers, excavated sections of the mound and traced a sequence of temples and buildings descending into astonishingly early levels. Among the most important investigations were those carried out by the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities in the mid-20th century, including work associated with Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd. What they found changed the conversation. Eridu was not simply an old Sumerian religious centre. It was old before what most people imagine when they hear the word Sumer. Its deepest excavated levels belonged to the Ubaid-period, the long prehistoric age before writing, before kings recorded their victories on clay tablets, before cities like Uruk developed the institutions we usually associate with urban civilization. In some reconstructions, Eridu's earliest occupation reaches back to around the late 6th millennium BCE, perhaps even earlier, depending on how the layers are interpreted and dated. That is a date so distant it can be hard to feel. The Great Pyramid of Egypt is closer to us than it was to Eridu's first settlers. And yet these earliest layers are often represented not by gold, statues, or written archives, but by something much more ordinary. Pottery, broken bowls, jars, cups, storage vessels, cooking pots. At first that may sound disappointing, but pottery is one of archaeology's most powerful clocks. People change the way they make pots. They favour different shapes, different rims, different painted designs, different clay mixtures, different firing methods. A vessel made in one period may look subtly, but consistently, different from one made centuries later. When the same pottery styles appear across multiple sites, archaeologists can compare them and build relative chronologies. This is how the Ubaid-period was first recognized and divided into phases, not through written dates, because there were no written dates yet, through patterns in material culture, especially ceramics, At Eridu, pottery helped archaeologists identify the sequence of occupation beneath the mound. Later, Ubaid pottery above. Earlier Ubaid pottery below. Building levels associated with changing ceramic traditions, each layer giving a clue to where it stood in time. But there is an important limit here. Pottery can often tell archaeologists that one layer is earlier or later than another. It can connect Eridu to wider cultural networks across southern Mesopotamia and beyond. But it does not always provide a precise calendar year. And when early excavators recorded layers incompletely, or when old trenches were not documented to modern standards, later scholars have to work with gaps. Sometimes a single potsherd becomes evidence. Sometimes it becomes an argument. Was this layer a house, a temple, or both? Was a change in pottery caused by migration, trade, imitation, or local experimentation? Did a building stand for decades, generations, or centuries? Did people abandon part of the site, or did the evidence simply wash away? These questions matter because Eridu has been made to carry an enormous claim, the first city, maybe the first city humans ever built. But before we decide whether that claim holds, we have to understand what the mound can actually tell us. Beneath Tel Abu Shirain are walls, floors, hearths, burials, pottery and temples. Evidence of real people making real decisions in a difficult wetland landscape. But beneath the evidence are still silences. Eridu has revealed enough to prove that something extraordinary began here, and left enough hidden to make us keep digging. So what do the deepest levels of Eridu actually show us? Not a city of kings, not a palace, not written laws, tax records, armies, or monuments announcing the names of rulers. They show us mud brick. The first people at Eridu built with the material that defined southern Mesopotamia for thousands of years afterward. They dug clay-rich mud from the ground, mixed it with water and temper, shaped it into bricks, and left those bricks to harden beneath the sun. Then they raised walls, laid floors, repaired cracks, and rebuilt whenever rain, rising damp, or simple daily use began to break the old structures down. It sounds humble, and it was, but this is where the story of Eridu becomes real. Before it became a sacred name in later Sumerian tradition, before it became the city of Enki, before scribes placed it at the beginning of kingship itself, Eridu was a community of people solving practical problems. Where do we sleep? Where do we store grain? How do we keep food dry? How do we feed children when the water changes, when the fish move, when herds need tending, when the fields do not produce enough? The earliest Ubaid levels beneath later construction are difficult to interpret because later generations built so heavily over them. In some areas, the best preserved early structures appear to be small ceremonial buildings, the ancestors of the temples that would eventually dominate the mound. But a ceremonial building cannot exist alone. Somebody mixed its mud brick. Somebody carried reeds, water, fish, grain, and fuel. Somebody made the pottery found around it. Somebody lived nearby. That is the crucial point. Even where archaeology preserves sacred architecture more clearly than ordinary houses, the settlement was sustained by households. And households leave a quieter kind of evidence. Fragments of storage jars, cooking vessels blackened by fire, grinding stones used to turn grain into flour, animal bones, fish bones, clay ceilings in later periods, broken tools, ash, floors worn smooth by feet that crossed them every day. A wall is never just a wall. It tells us that people had chosen to stay. For mobile hunter-gatherers, possessions must be light. A camp can be abandoned when resources shift, but mud brick houses are different. They represent labour invested in one place. They say that a family, or perhaps several related families, expected to return tomorrow, next season, next year. They expected their stored food to matter. They expected their children to grow up here. At Eridu, that decision was especially bold. Southern Mesopotamia was not naturally an easy place to build a permanent settlement. The region was low, wet, exposed, and constantly changing. Water could bring fish, reeds, transport, fertile soils, and access to game. But water could also flood floors, turn pathways to mud, leave salt in fields, and transform the shape of the landscape within a human lifetime. So the earliest community did not simply settle beside water. It learned how to live with it. Its food supply was probably diverse because it had to be. The people of early Eridu could draw on fish from marshes and channels, birds and other animals from the wetlands, wild plants, and the products of herding and cultivation. Sheep and goats were important across Ubaid Mesopotamia. Cattle may have been especially valuable in watery lowland environments where grazing land and reeds were available. Grain agriculture was becoming increasingly important too, though exactly how much each household depended on farming, fishing, herding, or gathering likely changed with season and location. This was not yet a society where everyone did one job. The same household might prepare food, tend animals, repair walls, shape clay, make tools, process reeds, and fish from the nearby water. Labour was organised around survival, but survival itself required knowledge. When to plant, when to harvest, which channel held fish, which reed beds could provide building material, how to store food so insects, moisture, and animals did not get to it first. And perhaps that is why pottery matters so much. A pot is not just an artifact. It is a piece of routine. The Ubaid pottery associated with Eridu and related settlements often includes carefully made vessels, sometimes painted with dark geometric designs on lighter surfaces. Bowls, jars, and other forms appear again and again across a vast area. The designs vary through time and from place to place, but the overall resemblance is unmistakable. People separated by long distances were making and using objects according to shared ideas. That does not necessarily mean one kingdom ruled them. There was no evidence for an Eridu empire spreading its authority across Mesopotamia in these early centuries. It does not even prove that everyone who used Ubaid-style pottery spoke the same language or belonged to one ethnic group. Material culture can spread through trade, imitation, intermarriage, seasonal movement, shared ritual, or simple practicality. But it does tell us that Eridu was not isolated. Imagine a bowl made by someone who had learned its shape from a parent. That parent had learned it from another generation. The pattern was repeated because people recognized it. Maybe it marked a familiar way of serving food. Maybe it belonged to gift exchange, feasting, marriage connections, or ritual gatherings. Maybe it simply reflected a style people considered proper. Whatever the exact reason, the pottery connected Eridu to a wider Ubaid world. A world of villages, hamlets, seasonal camps, workshops, and emerging ceremonial centres spread across southern Mesopotamia and far beyond it. And this raises a question archaeologists still debate. What exactly was early Eridu? Was it a small village that gradually acquired a sacred building? Was it a ritual focus from the beginning, a place where scattered communities gathered for ceremonies, exchange, and collective labour? Or was it both? The evidence allows more than one possibility. The early buildings beneath the later temple sequence suggest that ritual had an important role very early on. But ritual places need people around them. A shrine requires food, maintenance, offerings, builders, and visitors. And the domestic debris from Eridu's occupation tells us that ordinary life was happening in and around this sacred landscape. Maybe families lived here permanently. Maybe some came seasonally from nearby settlements. Maybe the population rose at certain times of year, when fishing, harvest, trade, or ceremonies drew people together. We cannot yet say with certainty, but we can say this: Eridu did not begin as an abstraction. It began with hands kneading mud into bricks, hands carrying water, hands gutting fish, hands grinding grain, hands mending nets, tending animals, lifting children, shaping pots, patching roofs before the next rain came. Later Mesopotamian tradition would turn Eridu into a place of gods and beginnings. It would place the city at the dawn of ordered civilization. But beneath those legends were residents whose names we do not know. People who never wrote down their ambitions, never carved their faces into stone, never imagined that thousands of years later the remains of their kitchens and floors would be studied as evidence of a world being born. They built the foundation, not only the foundation of later temples, the foundation beneath the legend of the first city. And as the settlement endured, one building at Eridu would begin to rise above the rest. And that building did not stay small. Again and again over centuries, perhaps over more than a millennium, people returned to the same place at Eridu and built another sacred structure. Not somewhere nearby, not on a fresh patch of ground, on the same spot. That is one of the most extraordinary facts about Eridu. Beneath the later temple remains, archaeologists uncovered a sequence of earlier buildings, one resting over another like the pages of a book pressed into mud. Each generation built, repaired, expanded, levelled, and raised the ground. Then the next generation did it again. A shrine became a larger shrine. A larger shrine became a formal temple. The temple became a raised platform, increasingly separated from the ordinary ground around it. By the time later Mesopotamian cities were building massive temple towers, the basic idea was already visible here. The god's house stood higher. It stood at the centre, and the community organized itself around it. The earlier structures in the sequence were modest by later standards. Mud brick rooms, plastered floors, simple rectangular plans. But they were not random houses. Their layout differs from ordinary domestic spaces. Some seem carefully arranged around a central room, with features that archaeologists interpret as altars, offering tables or platforms for ritual activity. We should be careful with that word, ritual. Archaeology can show us walls, entrances, floors, ash, broken pottery, animal bone, and repeated rebuilding. It can sometimes show us that a building had an unusual plan or an unusually prominent location. What it cannot do is let us stand in the room and hear what people said. We do not know the prayers spoken in Eridu's earliest shrine. We do not know whether a family brought fish, grain, milk, reeds, or small crafted objects as offerings. We do not know whether ceremonies marked planting, floodwaters, births, deaths, seasonal gatherings, or the arrival of people from neighbouring settlements. And we definitely cannot assume that the earliest builders were worshipping Enki exactly as later Sumerian texts described him. Those texts were written thousands of years after Eridu's first mud brick sanctuaries had disappeared beneath later construction. But repeated rebuilding tells us something important. This place mattered. Think about what it takes to rebuild a mud brick structure. Old walls have to be dismantled or buried. New bricks have to be made. Clay has to be dug, mixed, shaped, dried, and carried. Reeds, timber, plaster, and labour all have to be gathered. People must decide that this building deserves collective effort. Then they have to make the same decision again and again. A single shrine might be the project of one household, one lineage, or one local leader. A long chain of shrines built in precisely the same sacred location suggests continuity across generations. Memories outlasting individuals. Practices passed from parents to children. A community saying, in effect, This is where we come together. This is where the important things happen. This is where the world is made orderly. The architecture changed as that commitment deepened. Over time, the buildings became more substantial and more formal. Their plans developed the features familiar from later Mesopotamian temples: a long central hall, rooms arranged around it, and projecting buttresses and recessed walls that broke up the exterior surface. The entrance did not always lead straight to the most important room. In some temples, visitors appear to have moved through a sequence of spaces before reaching the central area. That matters because architecture can guide behavior. It can slow you down. It can separate the outer world from an inner one. It can control who enters, who watches, who prepares offerings, and who stands closest to whatever was considered sacred. But even here, caution matters. A building plan cannot tell us exactly who had authority. It cannot prove that priests ruled Eridu in the earliest Ubaid centuries, or that a single god had already become the unquestioned centre of local life. Those are tempting stories because later Mesopotamia gives us temples staffed by priests, supplied by fields, workshops, herds, storehouses, and administrators. Early Eridu may have been moving in that direction, but the evidence does not let us project the fully developed temple economies of later Sumer straight back onto the first shrine. What it does show is organization. A temple is never only a room. To keep one operating, somebody needs to maintain its walls. Somebody needs to prepare food and drink for gatherings. Somebody needs to store supplies. Somebody needs to coordinate labor when the building is repaired or rebuilt. Somebody has to remember the proper time to gather, the proper route to approach, the proper things to bring. That makes a temple more than a religious space. It becomes a social machine. In a small settlement, it may have been where disputes were discussed, alliances reinforced, marriages recognized, feasts held, shared labor organized, and visitors received. It may have helped connect households that otherwise spent much of their lives focused on their own food, animals, tools, and walls. And as Eridu grew, that role could grow with it. A central shrine gave people a reason to cooperate beyond immediate kinship. You might help make bricks not because the new building was your house, but because it belonged to the community. You might bring a portion of fish or grain, not only for your own family, but for a ceremony that linked your household to everyone else gathered there. That is a powerful idea. Before taxes, before written accounts, before kings carved their victories into stone, collective institutions could already mobilize labor. They could create obligations. They could turn scattered households into something more connected, more durable, more capable of acting together. The temple at Eridu kept rising because the community around it kept choosing to rise with it. And every rebuilding changed the landscape. When old walls were filled in and new floors laid above them, the sacred ground slowly grew higher. Mud brick crumbled, new brick replaced it, debris accumulated. Platforms were strengthened. The building stood increasingly above the wet, shifting world of channels and marshes around it. Eventually, sacred height became part of the message. The temple was not simply in the settlement, it was above it. Not yet necessarily a ziggurat in the later towering sense. That monumental form belonged to a more developed urban age. But the principle was taking shape. The holy place should be elevated, visible, enduring. It should anchor a city whose ordinary houses might be repaired, altered, or abandoned. Later Mesopotamia would repeat this pattern on an enormous scale. At Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, and other cities, temples became the great institutional centres of urban life. They were houses of gods, certainly, but they were also employers, landholders, storehouses, workshops, and administrative hubs. They received offerings, distributed rations, organised labour, preserved traditions, and helped make the city legible to itself. Each city had its own divine patron. Each sacred centre gave a population a shared identity. Eridu appears to preserve an early version of that Mesopotamian formula. A settlement rooted in water, a sacred building rebuilt through deep time. A community learning that one place, one institution, one inherited set of practices could hold people together across generations. And eventually later Mesopotamians would give that sacred place a name and a god. They would say Eridu belonged to Enki, lord of the deep waters beneath the earth. Enki, later known to Akkadian speakers as Ea, he was the god later Mesopotamians most strongly connected with Eridu, and he was not a god of dry earth, blazing sun, or distant mountain peaks. He belonged to water, but not just any water. Enki was lord of the Abzu. The word is often translated as the deep, the abyss, or the subterranean freshwater ocean believed to lie beneath the earth. In Mesopotamian imagination, this hidden reservoir was the source of springs, wells, marshes, rivers, and the life that rose from wet ground. That idea might sound strange now. We know rivers flow through landscapes shaped by rainfall, geology, melting snow, and groundwater. But for people living in southern Mesopotamia, fresh water could seem almost miraculous. The land around Eridu was flat, low, exposed to heat, wind, salt, and shifting channels. The great rivers brought life, but they could also flood, change course, or leave fields dry. Beyond the watered zones lay terrain where farming became increasingly difficult. And nearby was the sea, full of water that could not be drunk and could not nourish crops. Fresh water was not an abstraction. It was survival. It made reeds grow in thick beds along the channels. It filled lagoons with fish and birds. It supported grazing animals. It allowed mud brick to be made, crops to be planted, boats to move, and people to remain in one place long enough to build a community. So imagine the sacred logic of Eridu, a settlement standing at the edge of wetlands, dependent on waters that appeared, disappeared, spread outward, and sank into the ground. A temple rising above mud and reeds, beneath it all, according to the religious language developed later, an unseen freshwater realm. The Abzu, the hidden deep, the source from which life emerged. Enki was its master, and Enki was much more than a water god. In later Sumerian and Akkadian texts, he appears as a god of fertility, abundance, craftsmanship, intelligence, and hidden knowledge. He is associated with the skills that make civilization possible: building, making, organizing, healing, speaking wisely, understanding the secret structure of the world. He is often the clever god, the one who finds a solution when other gods cannot, the one who understands boundaries, channels, mixtures, transformations. Fresh water becoming crops, clay becoming brick, reed becoming roof matting or boat, raw material becoming an object made by skilled hands. That combination makes sense. Water is not only something people consume. It is what makes transformation possible. Add water to clay, and you can shape it. Add water to grain, and you can turn it into dough, beer, porridge. Control water in fields, and seeds become food. Travel by water, and distant communities become neighbours. For a society living among marshes and river channels, knowledge itself could feel watery. It moved, it flowed, it came from hidden places. It had to be guided carefully, or it could be lost. Later myths gave Enki an extraordinary role in the ordering of the world. In some stories, he helps assign the powers, roles, and proper functions that make civilization work. In others, he is a protector of humanity, a god who uses intelligence and indirect action instead of brute force. One famous flood tradition eventually casts Ea, the Akkadian form of Enki, as the god who secretly warns a human being of a coming catastrophe. The divine assembly has decided that a flood will destroy humanity. Ea cannot openly defy that decision. So he speaks to a wall, or perhaps through a wall, telling the human hero to build a boat. It is one of the oldest narrative patterns on Earth. A god, a flood, a chosen survivor, a vessel carrying life through destruction. And Eridu sits near the beginning of that story. But this is where we have to separate deep memory from direct evidence. The earliest levels at Eridu date back into the Ubaid-period, thousands of years before the surviving written myths about Enki were composed. Those first mud brick sanctuaries did not leave us inscriptions saying, "This building belongs to Enki." No priest from early Eridu wrote down a hymn explaining the Abzu. No worshipper left a clear theological manual beneath the temple floor. The people who built the earliest shrine may have honoured a local water spirit, an ancestral power, a fertility deity, or a sacred presence whose name was later forgotten. It is possible that an early cult gradually developed into the worship of Enki. It is also possible that later Mesopotamians looked at Eridu's immense antiquity and attached their great god of fresh water and wisdom to a place that already seemed older than memory. We cannot know exactly when that connection became fixed. What we can say is that by the time written Mesopotamian traditions become available, Eridu and Enki were inseparable. Eridu was his city. Its temple was called the Abzu, the House of the Abzu. Not simply a building dedicated to a god, but a constructed link between the human settlement and the hidden waters beneath the world. That is a powerful claim for a city to make. Other cities could boast of armies, walls, kings, trade fields, harbours, or monuments. Eridu could claim something more ancient. It was connected to the source. Not the source of political power, the source of life itself. And that may help explain a mystery. Eridu never became the dominant imperial capital of Mesopotamia. It did not grow into the enormous urban machine that Uruk would become. It did not command the military strength of later royal cities. Political power shifted. River courses shifted. Trade routes shifted. Kings rose elsewhere, but Eridu remained important. Because religious importance plays by different rules. A city can lose population and still retain prestige. It can lose control of territory and still be visited by pilgrims. It can be overshadowed by a larger neighbour and still preserve the authority of age, origin, and sacred tradition. Think about it. If your city was believed to stand close to the Abzu, close to Enki, close to the deep freshwater foundation beneath the earth, then Eridu was not merely one settlement among many. It was a place where the world began to make sense. That kind of prestige could survive political decline for centuries, maybe millennia. Later, Mesopotamian rulers understood this. They restored temples at ancient holy places not only out of devotion, but because ancient sanctuaries gave their own power legitimacy. To honour Eridu was to place yourself within a chain of tradition reaching back beyond written history. And Enki gave that tradition a personality. He was not the god of conquest, not primarily the god of thunder, kingship, or war. He was the god who knew what lay beneath the surface. Beneath the fields, beneath the marshes, beneath the visible order of things. At Eridu that mattered, because this was a city built in a world where the most important force was often invisible. Fresh water beneath the ground, channels hidden by reeds, fish beneath dark water, seeds beneath mud, the future beneath the labour of rebuilding. Enki was lord of the deep waters, but he was also lord of the knowledge needed to live beside them. And as Eridu's sacred reputation grew, that knowledge would become part of something larger than worship. It would become part of the city's claim to be a beginning. A beginning, but beginnings do not stay small for long. Once a community can remain in one place across generations, something changes. People stop thinking only about the next season. They begin investing in structures that will outlive them. They repair walls, they deepen channels, they build storage spaces. They raise shrines on top of older shrines. They create obligations between households. They make decisions that only make sense if they expect their children and their children's children to still be there. That is what we see at Eridu, not a city appearing overnight from empty marshland. Not a single inventor deciding, today we will create civilization. What the archaeology shows is slower, messier, and in some ways more remarkable. A settlement growing through repeated acts of return. A small sacred place becoming a larger organized community. A community becoming influential enough to draw people, goods, labor, and ideas into one location. By the later Ubaid-period, roughly the 6th millennium BCE, Eridu was no longer just a cluster of reed shelters beside useful water. Its mound contained successive buildings, increasingly substantial architecture, and above all a temple complex rebuilt again and again on the same sacred spot. That repetition matters. A temple is not just a building. It is a commitment. Building one requires mud brick, timber, reeds, labour, planning, and people willing to work for a purpose beyond their own household. Rebuilding it on the same place requires something even more difficult: collective memory. Someone had to say, this is where the old sanctuary stood. This is where the new one must rise. And everyone else had to agree that the place mattered enough to organize around it. At first, that organization may have been relatively simple. A respected family, a council of elders, ritual specialists whose authority came from their knowledge of ceremonies, seasons, water, ancestors, or local sacred traditions. We do not have written records from early Eridu telling us who gave orders or how labor was divided. There are no surviving lists of rations, taxes, priests, or work gangs from these earliest levels. But monumental building leaves a social footprint. It suggests that people could gather labor beyond the scale of one family. It suggests they could accumulate materials. It suggests they could coordinate work over time. And that points toward a new kind of society. The wetlands around Eridu were rich, but richness alone does not create complexity. Fish, birds, reeds, grazing land, and fertile mud could feed people. Yet if every household had to spend every waking hour finding food, repairing shelter, and surviving the next flood or dry spell, there would be little time for full-time builders, craft specialists, ritual personnel, or organizers. Surplus changes that equation. If farms produced more grain than a household immediately needed, if herders had more animals than they could consume, if fishing and marsh resources could reliably supplement diets, then some people could be supported while doing other work. They could shape bricks, make pottery, build boats, maintain shrines, organize storage, lead rituals, travel to distant communities, develop specialized skills that took years to learn. This is one of the quiet revolutions behind urban life. Not everyone has to do the same thing anymore. One household grows food, another makes pots, another repairs a boat, someone knows how to manage a work crew, someone knows which offerings belong in a ceremony, someone remembers where the channels ran last season and where they may run next year. Individually, these roles are small. Together, they create interdependence. And interdependence is powerful. It allows a settlement to do things that scattered households cannot. It can raise a larger building, dig or maintain a watercourse, store food against a bad year, receive visitors, support people whose work is not directly tied to food production. It can become a centre, a place other communities look toward. There are signs that Eridu was becoming exactly that kind of place. Its continued expansion and its prominent temple suggest a community with growing population and growing regional importance. The settlement was part of the broader Ubaid world, a culture spread across much of Mesopotamia and beyond. Across this enormous area, archaeologists find similarities in pottery styles, architecture, burial customs, and small objects. These similarities do not mean that everyone belonged to one kingdom. There was no Ubaid empire ruling from Eridu, but they do suggest contact. Ideas were moving, goods were moving, people may have been moving too. Southern Mesopotamia had mud, reeds, fish, and fertile alluvium. It did not have everything. Good building stone was scarce. Metal ores had to come from far away. Hardwoods, shells, pigments, and unusual stones often travelled through exchange networks that linked the river plains to Iran, Anatolia, the Gulf, and perhaps regions even farther beyond. A pot can travel, so can a bead, so can a boatload of bitumen, a block of stone, a marriage partner, a ritual practice, or a story about a distant sacred place. Eridu stood near waterways that connected marsh, river, and gulf. That position may have made it more than a local settlement. It may have been a node in a much larger network, a meeting point between inland communities and people moving along the coast. And once exchange networks exist, influence does not have to look like conquest. A place can become important because people pass through it, because it has a sanctuary worth visiting, because its crafts are respected, because its leaders can organize feasts, trade, labor, or ritual, because it is known as a reliable place to obtain supplies, settle disputes, honor a god, or renew alliances. This is where the temple may have become more than a sacred building. Later Mesopotamian temples were major institutions. They owned land, employed workers, stored grain, managed herds, sponsored craft production, and redistributed resources. But we should be careful about projecting that fully developed system backward onto Eridu in the 6th millennium BCE. The earliest temple levels do not provide direct proof of bureaucrats managing an economy from behind mud brick walls. Still, the basic possibility is difficult to ignore. A temple was a place where labour could be gathered. Offerings could be collected, food could be stored or distributed. Seasonal work could be coordinated. Shared rituals could turn many households into a community with common obligations. Religion in this sense was not separate from practical life. It could help organise practical life. If the temple was where people met the sacred power behind water, fertility and abundance, then contributing grain, labour or livestock to that place may have felt less like paying a tax and more like helping sustain the order that kept everyone alive. That does not mean early Eridu was already a state. It means it was experimenting with the ingredients from which states could eventually emerge. And that brings us to one of the biggest arguments surrounding Eridu. Was it truly a city? Later Mesopotamian traditions certainly treated it that way. The Sumerian King List, written thousands of years after Eridu's earliest occupation, places kingship there before the flood. For later scribes, Eridu was not merely ancient. It was the first city, the first seat of ordered human rule. Archaeology gives a more cautious answer. Eridu was large and important by the standards of its time. It had long-term occupation, monumental religious architecture, a growing population, and connections extending far beyond its immediate landscape. But it did not yet resemble Uruk at its later height, with its immense population, dense neighbourhoods, administrative institutions, mass-produced goods, and unmistakable urban scale. So perhaps the better question is not, was Eridu a city, yes or no? Perhaps the better question is, what does a city look like while it is still becoming one? Urbanization is not a switch that flips. It is a process. A settlement grows. Labour becomes more coordinated. Surplus supports specialists. Sacred spaces become institutions. Trade networks widen. Social differences deepen. Decisions begin to affect not dozens of people, but hundreds, then thousands. At Eridu, we can watch some of those changes gathering beneath layers of mud brick. The city had not fully arrived, but the experiment had begun. But an experiment is never carried out in a vacuum. Eridu was important. Its temple was important. Its position near water, marshland, and the Gulf was important. But if we imagine it standing alone, one brilliant settlement surrounded by emptiness, we miss the real story. Eridu was part of a world already becoming connected. Across Mesopotamia, from the wet southern plain to the rain-fed lands of the north, communities were changing at the same time. They were building more permanent houses, producing pottery in recognizable styles, developing local ritual traditions, trading materials across distances that would have seemed enormous to a single farming household. Some were small villages, some were growing ceremonial centres, some occupied river valleys, others sat in dry farming zones where rain, rather than irrigation, determined whether a harvest succeeded. They did not all become complex in the same way, and they did not all need Eridu to tell them how. This is one of the most important things archaeology has revealed about the Ubaid-period. The cultural world associated with southern Mesopotamia spread widely, but spread does not mean conquest. Similar pottery does not automatically mean a single government. Similar temples do not prove that priests in Eridu were issuing orders to villages hundreds of miles away. A painted bowl can move through trade. A potter can copy a style. A family can migrate. A ritual specialist can travel. A marriage alliance can carry customs farther than an army ever could. Across the south, sites such as Ur and Tel al-Ubaid show that Eridu had neighbours, rivals, trading partners, and perhaps ritual allies. All would later become one of the great cities of Mesopotamian history, a royal centre with temples, tombs, and wealth drawn from a wide commercial world. But during the Ubaid period it was part of the same larger southern landscape. Settlements clustered around shifting watercourses, fields, marshes, and routes leading toward the Gulf. Tel al-Ubaid near Ur gave its name to the archaeological culture that now helps us identify this entire period. Its painted pottery, distinctive architecture, and material traditions resemble discoveries from many other settlements. But resemblance is not identity. The people of each settlement lived in their own environment, made local decisions, and adapted broad cultural practices to local needs. Eridu may have been one of the earliest and most symbolically powerful centres in this world. Its deep sequence of temples suggests an unusually persistent sacred importance. Later Mesopotamian tradition would remember it as the city of Enki, lord of the freshwater deep. That memory may preserve an echo of Eridu's ancient connection to water, abundance, and ritual authority. But there is no evidence that Eridu ruled an Ubaid empire. No palace archive tells us that its officials collected tribute from distant towns. No royal inscriptions name conquered territories. No army appears in the archaeological record marching north with Eridu's banner. In fact, banners may not even have existed yet. What we see instead is something more subtle and, in some ways, more revolutionary, a shared cultural horizon. Across a vast area, people began using related forms of pottery, building similar kinds of public structures, and participating in exchange networks that linked communities with very different landscapes. To the south, life depended on mastering water. The Mesopotamian plain was fertile, but it was also unstable. Rivers shifted, channels clogged, floods could nourish fields or destroy them. Marshes provided fish, birds, reeds, and grazing land, yet they demanded boats, local knowledge, and constant adaptation. Communities like Eridu grew within this watery environment by combining farming with fishing, herding, transport, and perhaps the early management of canals and watercourses. Further north, the equation was different. Northern Mesopotamia had rolling plains, foothills, and areas where people could farm with rainfall alone. Their villages did not need the same intensive systems of water control that would later define southern cities. Their problems were different. Rain could fail, seasons could be unpredictable. Access to good land, grazing territory, stone, timber, and mountain resources could shape the fate of a settlement. Sites in northern Mesopotamia, including places such as Tepe Gara and Tel Brak, show that complex communities were also emerging beyond the southern marshes. They had their own histories, their own local traditions, and their own routes toward larger social organization. In some places, southern-style Ubaid pottery and architecture appear. But archaeologists still debate what exactly that means. Did people from the south move north? Did northern communities adopt styles they found useful, prestigious, or sacred? Did traders and craftspeople create a shared language of objects without creating a shared political system? The honest answer is that we do not know every part of the process. But we know enough to reject the old, simple picture. Civilization beginning at one point, then radiating outward like light from a lamp. The reality was more like a river system, many streams feeding one floodplain. Eridu was one stream, a powerful one, perhaps an early sacred centre whose influence travelled along waterways and exchange routes. But Ur was another. Tel al-Ubaid was another. Northern communities were another. Villages in the Zagros foothills along the Euphrates and near the Gulf all contributed knowledge, materials, customs, and people to the wider transformation. Stone came from regions where stone existed. Metal ores came from lands beyond the alluvial plain. Timber came from farther north or east. Shells moved inland from the sea. Bitumen, essential for waterproofing boats and baskets, connected settlements through practical necessity. And with these materials came information. How to build a boat that could survive a marsh channel. How to fire pottery more consistently. How to organize a feast for hundreds of people. How to mark a burial. How to construct a shrine. How to make strangers into trading partners instead of enemies. That last achievement may have mattered most, because large-scale society is not built only by rulers giving commands. It is built by trust extending beyond the household, by repeated exchanges, by obligations remembered across seasons, by communities learning that cooperation with distant people can bring advantages that isolation cannot. Eridu's importance lies partly in this larger world. It was not merely a beginning point, it was a meeting point, a place where southern Mesopotamia's particular challenges, water, mud, marsh, fertility, and transport, produced one powerful answer to the problem of living together at scale. Other communities found other answers. Over time, these experiments would interact, compete, borrow from one another, and accelerate. And eventually, later Mesopotamians would look back at this connected, complicated past and tell a much cleaner story. They would say that kingship first descended from heaven, and that it first came to Eridu. That is exactly what the Sumerian King List says. Not that Eridu became powerful, not that it was one important city among many. It says kingship descended from heaven, and Eridu received it first. The wording is extraordinary. Kingship does not begin with a family. It does not emerge from a council, an army, a successful harvest, or a village deciding that someone needs to take charge. It descends, it comes down from the gods as a force already formed, already legitimate, already woven into the structure of the world. And the first place it touches is Eridu. For later Mesopotamian scribes, this was not a small claim. Kingship meant far more than a man wearing a crown. It meant the right to organize labor, command armies, judge disputes, oversee temples, mobilize resources, and speak for a city before the gods. To say that kingship began at Eridu was to put this old sacred settlement at the beginning of political order itself. But then the king list becomes even stranger. It names rulers of Eridu who supposedly reigned for periods so long they break every normal measure of human history. One king rules for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. In some versions, Eridu has two antediluvian kings whose combined reigns stretch across more than 64,000 years. Then kingship moves on, from Eridu to Bad Tabira, from Bad Tabira to Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. City after city receives kingship in a sequence that sounds less like a historical record and more like a sacred relay. Authority passes across the ancient landscape, one city holding it for an age before it moves to the next. And across the entire period before the flood, the numbers become enormous. Depending on the version of the text, a small number of kings rule for more than 200,000 years in total. No archaeologist thinks these are literal reign lengths. Eridu is ancient, very ancient. Its earliest known occupation reaches back into the 6th millennium BCE. But it was not ruled by immortal monarchs for tens of thousands of years. The city's excavated remains give us houses, pottery, temples, burials, mud brick, and layers of rebuilding. They do not give us evidence for named kings governing before the invention of writing. And that difference matters. The king list is not a report written by witnesses to Eridu's first settlement. The surviving copies were written thousands of years after Eridu began. They belong to a literate Mesopotamian world that had already seen cities rise and fall, dynasties compete, empires expand, and ancient temples claim authority through their connection to deep time. So what were the scribes doing? In part, they were creating order out of a past that was already unimaginably old. Think about the problem they faced. Mesopotamia was filled with ancient ruins. Mounds rose above the plain, each one containing the remains of settlements older than anyone could remember. Cities claimed great gods, famous ancestors, old temples, and royal traditions. Different places had different stories about who had come first, who had ruled first, who had been favoured by heaven. The king list gathered that messy past and arranged it into a single line. Kingship begins in heaven. Heaven gives it to Eridu. It passes through a chain of ancient cities. Then comes a flood. After the flood, kingship begins again, now at Kish. This was not chronology in the modern sense. It was something more like an argument about legitimacy, a map of rightful power, a way of saying that political authority had a sacred origin, that it moved according to divine order, and that every later dynasty stood somewhere within a story much older than itself. The impossible reign lengths are part of that argument. Before the flood, time is different. The kings are larger than life because the world itself is larger than life. This is the age before the Great Dividing Line, before catastrophe reset the human story. The numbers tell us we have entered mythic time, a time of beginnings when gods and humans stood closer together, and the foundations of civilization were first laid down. That does not make the tradition meaningless. It makes it meaningful in a different way. When later scribes placed Eridu first, they may have been preserving a genuine cultural memory. Eridu was recognized as exceptionally old, exceptionally sacred, and deeply associated with the forces that made settled life possible. Water, fertility, ritual knowledge, the god Enki, the ordered abundance that allowed people to live together in a difficult landscape. Eridu's ancient temples had been rebuilt again and again. Its name carried weight long after other centres had eclipsed it politically. A scribe living in a later age could look at Eridu and see more than a decaying mound on the southern plain. They could see the first place where divine order entered human society. And there may have been another reason. Eridu was a safe beginning. Later royal capitals could claim military strength. They could boast of conquests, walls, palaces, and tribute. But Eridu belonged to a deeper category. It was not remembered primarily as the city of one conquering dynasty. It was remembered as the city of Enki, the god of the freshwater deep, of cunning intelligence, craft, and life-giving abundance. To begin kingship at Eridu was to suggest that rule did not begin with violence. It began with order, with water made useful, with ritual made permanent, with a community learning how to survive in the land between rivers. The flood framework also connected the King List to a much broader Mesopotamian tradition. Across different texts, the Great Flood appears again and again. In the story of Atrahasis, the gods decide to destroy humanity, and one man is warned. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives the deluge and tells his story to a king searching for immortality. In the Sumerian flood tradition, the survivor is called Ziusudra. The names change, the details shift. The gods argue, warn, punish, regret, and preserve. But the basic shape remains. An old world ends in water, and human life continues only because someone receives divine knowledge in time. The King List takes that flood memory and turns it into political history. Before the flood, Eridu stands at the beginning. After the flood, kingship returns to the world and begins its long journey through the cities of Mesopotamia. It is a breathtaking transformation. An old settlement near marshes and waterways becomes more than an archaeological site, more than a temple town, more than one community in the Ubaid landscape. It becomes the first throne of humanity, or at least the first throne as Mesopotamian scribes wanted humanity to remember it. And that raises the next question. If the flood was not simply a date on a timeline, what kind of memory was it carrying? What kind of memory was it carrying? To understand that, we have to leave the King List behind for a moment and enter the stories themselves. Because Mesopotamia did not preserve just one flood story. It preserved several. The oldest surviving version is incomplete, broken across damaged Sumerian tablets, but its hero is called Ziusudra. His name means something like life of long days, which is fitting because he is the man who survives when the old world is destroyed. In later Akkadian tradition, the survivor is Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh he is Utnapishtim. He found life, different names, different literary settings, different emphases, but underneath them all is the same terrifying pattern. Human beings become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive, or somehow too offensive to the gods. The divine assembly decides that humanity must be wiped away. A flood is sent. Not a bad season, not a river overflowing its banks for a few days. A world-ending flood, vast enough to erase cities, people, animals, and the ordinary boundaries between land and water. Then one god breaks ranks. That god is Enki, or Ea, as he was known in Akkadian. And that matters for Eridu. Enki was not just any god in the Mesopotamian imagination. He was the lord of the freshwater deep beneath the earth, the life-giving underground waters called the Abzu. He was associated with wisdom, craft, ritual knowledge, clever solutions, and the dangerous abundance of water itself. Eridu was his city, its temple was his house. Its sacred identity was built around the idea that beneath the dry, salty, difficult landscape of southern Mesopotamia lay a hidden source of life. So when the flood comes, Enki occupies a strange position. He is connected to water, but he is also the god who preserves humanity from water. In the Atrahasis story, Enki cannot simply defy the other gods openly. They have sworn an oath to keep the plan secret. So he speaks to a wall, or perhaps to the reed hut behind which Atrahasis is sleeping. He tells the structure to listen. Then, through that loophole, he gives the warning, tear down your house. Build a boat, save life. It is one of the most unforgettable scenes in ancient literature. A god speaking to reeds in order to save a human being from the decision of the gods. In the later epic of Gilgamesh, Ea gives Utnapishtim the same warning. Build a great vessel. Take aboard family, craftsmen, animals, seed, the living things needed for survival. Then the storm comes, the heavens roar, the land disappears beneath water. Even the gods, in some versions, recoil at the destruction they have unleashed. And in the Sumerian story of Ziusudra, the surviving text is frustratingly damaged. We do not have every line, but the broad structure is clear enough. The gods decree a flood. Ziusudra receives warning and survives in a great boat. When the waters finally recede, he offers sacrifice. The gods grant him a transformed existence, sending him to dwell far away in a place beyond ordinary human life. This is not a newspaper report from the 4th millennium BCE. It is myth, it is theology, it is literature built over generations, copied and reshaped by scribes who lived long after Eridu's first mud-brick temples had risen from the marshes. But myths do not appear from nowhere, and in southern Mesopotamia flood was never an abstract fear. Imagine living on a plain so flat that the horizon seems almost level with the sky, a land made by rivers but also threatened by them. The Tigris and Euphrates did not flow through stable, permanent channels. They shifted, they broke through banks, they abandoned old courses and created new ones. Heavy rainfall far to the north, beyond the view of anyone living near Eridu, could eventually send a surge of water down into the southern plain. A community might wake up to find fields gone, canals destroyed, houses softened into collapsing mud, grain stores ruined, livestock drowned, burial grounds washed away. For people whose homes were built from mud brick, floodwater was not just inconvenient. It could dissolve the physical world around them, and it was not only river flooding. Southern Mesopotamia was shaped by marshes, tides, seasonal rainfall, shifting shorelines, and the constant tension between fresh water and salt water. Too little water meant drought, too much meant destruction. The same rivers that made settlement possible could turn without warning into forces of chaos. That gives the flood stories their psychological power. The flood was not merely death, it was the reversal of civilization. Fields become water, houses become mud, city walls vanish, temples fall silent. The ordered world people had built through labour, irrigation, ritual and cooperation is pulled apart, and the landscape returns to something older, wetter and uncontrolled. For a culture that saw civilization as a fragile achievement, this was the ultimate nightmare. And if you enjoy this kind of investigation, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website, with the link in the description. It goes deeper into the moments where archaeology, legend, and unanswered questions collide. So, did an actual flood inspire these stories? Probably not one single flood. That is the answer historians and archaeologists have to give, even if it is less dramatic than the legend. Excavators have found flood deposits at several ancient Mesopotamian sites. At places like Shuruppak, Kish, and Ur, layers of water-laid sediment have sometimes appeared between phases of occupation. These discoveries were once greeted with enormous excitement. Could this be proof of the Great Flood? Could archaeologists have found the physical scar left by the deluge of Ziusudra or Utnapishtim? But the evidence does not line up that neatly. The flood layers belong to different places and, in many cases, different dates. One settlement may show evidence of a major inundation, while another nearby continued without the same interruption. Some deposits may reflect river floods. Others may reflect local changes in waterways, marsh conditions, or sediment movement. Eridu itself does not provide one clear universal destruction layer that can be matched to a single all-Mesopotamian catastrophe. And that is exactly what we should expect. A flood large enough to cover every city in Mesopotamia at the same moment, let alone the entire world, would leave an archaeological signature far beyond one patchy layer at one mound. We do not have that evidence, but regional disasters do not need to be universal to become universal in memory. A flood devastating enough to erase a cluster of settlements, displace thousands of people, destroy harvests, and force survivors onto higher ground could become the defining event of generations. Stories would travel with refugees, priests would connect the disaster to divine anger, rulers would use it to explain why an old order ended and a new one began. Over centuries, separate flood memories could merge into one greater story, the time when the world before our world was washed away. That is where Eridu enters the story with such force. It was the city of the god who understood water better than anyone, the god of the freshwater deep, the keeper of wisdom, the divine figure clever enough to preserve life even when the highest gods had chosen destruction. Whether a specific historical flood struck Eridu and became the origin of the myth, we cannot say. But culturally, the connection makes perfect sense. When Mesopotamian scribes imagined the threshold between the world before the flood and the world after it, Eridu was already waiting at the beginning, ancient, sacred, associated with the waters beneath the earth, associated with Enki, the god who knew that survival depended on knowledge delivered in time. The flood stories, then, are not evidence that Eridu was literally the first city ever built before a global deluge. They are evidence of something arguably more revealing. They show how later Mesopotamians understood the fragility of everything Eridu represented. A city could rise from water, a temple could be rebuilt for centuries. Kingship could descend from heaven, and still all of it could disappear. Because eventually another city would rise to dominate the southern plain. A city with walls, markets, bureaucracy, monumental temples, and a scale Eridu had never reached. Its name was Uruk. Uruk, by the late 4th millennium BCE, this city was becoming something Mesopotamia had never seen before. Not just a large settlement, not just a sacred centre with a temple at its heart, a true urban giant. At its height, Uruk may have covered hundreds of hectares, with a population measured not in hundreds or a few thousand, but perhaps tens of thousands of people. The exact number is impossible to know. Mud brick does not preserve census records. Ancient houses have been rebuilt over, robbed out, dissolved by rain, and buried beneath later occupation. But the scale is undeniable. Uruk was enormous, and its rise changed the balance of power across southern Mesopotamia. Picture the landscape around 3500 BCE. The southern plain is no longer a scattered collection of small villages and temple communities linked by waterways. It is becoming a network of competing centres. Each one has fields, canals, shrines, craft workers, fishermen, herders, traders, and local traditions. But some places are growing faster than others. Uruk was one of them. Actually, it was probably the most important of them. Its temples expanded into monumental complexes. Its builders raised enormous platforms, enclosed sacred spaces, and created structures on a scale that required organised labour far beyond a single extended community. Thousands of mud bricks had to be shaped, reed mats had to be gathered, bitumen had to be brought in, timber, stone, shell, metals and other raw materials had to move across long distances into a region that possessed very little of them naturally. And none of that happens by accident. A city of Uruk's size needed administration. It needed people to measure grain, distribute rations, organize work gangs, record deliveries, control storehouses, and keep track of what came in and what went out. This is the world in which some of the earliest known writing appears. Not epic poetry, not love letters, not kings boasting about conquest. At least not at first. The earliest writing from Uruk is often painfully practical. Lists, numbers, accounts, signs scratched into clay tablets to track grain, beer, sheep, textiles, labour and goods. It may not sound dramatic, but this was revolutionary. Human beings were beginning to build institutions that could remember things no single person could hold in their head. A temple official could die. A merchant could leave. A generation could pass, but the clay tablet remained. That changed everything, because once a city can record obligations, rations, harvests, and transactions, it can coordinate people at a completely different scale. It can turn seasonal labour into a system. It can support specialised workers who do not spend every day producing their own food. Potters, weavers, metalworkers, priests, administrators. Builders, traders moving through networks that reached far beyond the southern plain. And Uruk's influence did reach far. Archaeologists have found evidence of what is often called the Uruk expansion. Southern Mesopotamian styles, goods, administrative practices, and sometimes settlements appearing across parts of northern Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and western Iran. Exactly what this expansion meant is still debated. Some places may have been colonies, others may have been trading enclaves. Some local communities may simply have adopted Uruk-style tools of administration because they were useful. But whatever the mechanism, Uruk was no longer just one city among many. It was becoming a force, and that makes Eridu's position more interesting, not less. Because Eridu had something Uruk could not manufacture: antiquity. Eridu was old even by Mesopotamian standards. Its temple mound represented generations of rebuilding, generations of ritual, generations of people returning to the same sacred ground beside the waters. Later tradition remembered it as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the home of Enki, lord of the freshwater deep. Uruk could grow larger, it could become richer, it could develop more powerful institutions and more extensive networks. But it could not become older than Eridu. In ancient Mesopotamia that mattered. A city's importance was not measured only by its size, its wealth, or the military power of its rulers. It was also measured by its relationship to the gods, by the age of its cults, and by the sacred memories attached to its soil. Eridu's authority was rooted in a claim deeper than politics. It was the place of beginnings. Uruk's authority was increasingly something else. Scale, organization, movement, the ability to gather people, goods, labor, and information into one vast human machine. This does not mean Uruk suddenly appeared, and Eridu instantly collapsed. That is the tempting version of history. One city rises, another falls, a clean handoff of power. The archaeology suggests something messier. Eridu continued to be occupied through periods when Uruk was expanding. Its sacred precinct remained important. Its temple continued to receive attention and rebuilding. The city did not simply vanish when its larger neighbour became dominant, but relative importance can change long before a place is abandoned. A town that once stood near the centre of a regional network can become more peripheral as trade routes shift, waterways move, populations concentrate elsewhere, and new political institutions emerge. That may be what happened to Eridu, not one final disaster. Not one conquering army reducing everything to ash, but a long adjustment to a changing world. As Uruk drew more people into its orbit, it may have offered opportunities Eridu could not match. More workshops, more trade, more administrative work, more connections to distant regions, more reason for farmers, labourers, craft specialists, and ambitious families to settle near the growing giant. And yet Eridu still mattered, because people do not abandon sacred geography as easily as they abandon a market. A city can lose political influence and remain spiritually central. It can have fewer people, less trade, and less control over the surrounding countryside, while still holding the memory of the gods. Pilgrims may still come, priests may still serve, rulers from other cities may still honour its temple because its antiquity gives legitimacy to their own power. That is one of the most important things to understand about early Mesopotamia. There was no single ladder with Eridu at the bottom and Uruk at the top. There was a network. Cities had different strengths. One controlled trade, another commanded labour, another sat beside a crucial canal, another possessed a famous temple, another became associated with kingship, warfare, or a particular god. Their fortunes rose and fell as rivers shifted, climates changed, populations moved, and political alliances formed or broke apart. Uruk's rise did not erase Eridu. It changed the world Eridu lived in. And as the great southern cities continued to grow, another power would emerge nearby. Not a replacement for Eridu's sacred identity, but a city that would eventually stand beside it in a new relationship between temple, royalty, and the changing waters of the land. Ur. Ur was close, not close in the modern sense, with highways and city lights and suburbs stretching from one place to the next, but close enough that the relationship between the two cities would have shaped the lives of everyone living in this corner of southern Mesopotamia. Eridu lay to the southwest of Ur, both cities built in a landscape that was never fixed for long. Channels shifted, marshes expanded and contracted, fields were cut by canals. The shoreline of the Gulf moved over centuries and millennia. A journey that might have followed a waterway in one generation could require a different route in the next. But these were not isolated worlds. Eridu was the old sacred place, the home of Enki and the memory of beginnings. Ur was becoming something different, a royal power. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Ur had developed into one of the great cities of southern Mesopotamia. It was large, strategically placed, and connected to the waterways that tied the alluvial plain to the Gulf. Its rulers could draw wealth from agriculture, from canal traffic, from herds moving across the surrounding land, and from trade routes reaching far beyond Mesopotamia. This was a region with almost no natural stone, little timber, and limited metal. Yet the cities of Sumer used all of those materials. They built with imported wood, they made tools and ornaments from metals brought from distant mountains. They used stone, shell, and precious materials that had travelled through networks spanning Iran, Anatolia, the Gulf, and perhaps even the Indus Valley. Ur sat in a position to benefit from that movement. Goods could come up from the Gulf. Grain, wool, textiles, and manufactured products could move outward. Boats carried cargo more efficiently than carts ever could across the flat, muddy plain. A city with access to navigable channels was not simply connected. It was powerful, and Ur did not just become a commercial centre. It became a dynastic centre. In the early dynastic period, rulers of Ur appear among the competing kings of southern Mesopotamia. Then, much later, around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the city would become the heart of what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III. Its kings built an administrative system of extraordinary reach, recording deliveries, taxes, labour obligations, animals, land and rations on tens of thousands of clay tablets. It was bureaucracy on a massive scale. Grain counted. Wool counted. Workers counted. Days of labour counted. A field was not just a field anymore, it was an entry in a system. A herd was not just animals moving through reeds and pasture. It was an asset to be registered, assigned, and accounted for. Ur's rulers projected power across much of Mesopotamia. They built temples, controlled labour, appointed officials, and presented themselves as guardians of cosmic order. Their city became a place where kingship was visible in mud brick, tablets, processions, storehouses, and monuments. Most famously, Ur's great ziggurat rose over the city as a monumental statement of royal devotion and institutional power. But here is the important part. Ur did not need Eridu to disappear in order to become great, and Eridu did not need to rule an empire in order to remain important. This is where modern assumptions can mislead us. We tend to imagine neighbouring cities as permanent enemies, each trying to destroy the other. Sometimes Mesopotamian cities absolutely did fight. Their kings raided, conquered, taxed, and claimed territory. The historical record is full of rivalry, but rivalry was only part of the story. Cities also depended on one another. A royal city needed sacred legitimacy. A trading city needed agricultural hinterlands. A temple needed labour, offerings, administrators, and access to regional networks. Farmers needed canals maintained across boundaries that may have been political one year and irrelevant the next. Merchants needed secure routes, priests needed patrons, kings needed gods, and Eridu had Enki. For later Mesopotamians, Enki was not just another local deity. He was lord of the freshwater deep, the Abzu, the hidden reservoir imagined beneath the earth. He was associated with wisdom, craft, ritual knowledge, fertility, and the ordering forces that made civilization possible. That connection gave Eridu an authority that no amount of commercial traffic could easily replace. Texts composed centuries after Eridu's earliest occupation continued to treat it as a place of immense sacred importance. The city was remembered as Enki's seat. It appeared in myths about the beginnings of order, the origins of kingship, and the world before the flood. Even when political power had shifted elsewhere, Eridu remained embedded in the religious map of Mesopotamia. That does not prove that pilgrims arrived in endless processions every year. Archaeology cannot always recover a pilgrim's footsteps. A small offering can vanish. A temporary visitor may leave almost nothing behind. But the continued attention given to Eridu's sacred precinct suggests that the site was more than a fading village. It may have remained a destination, a place where cult personnel maintained rituals, a place where offerings were brought, a place where regional communities preserved an old relationship with Enki and the waters that sustained them. Perhaps rulers from Ur and other cities supported Eridu's cult because honouring such an ancient sanctuary strengthened their own claims to rule. In Mesopotamia, political authority was never entirely separate from divine approval. A king did not merely command soldiers and officials. He was expected to build temples, feed gods, restore shrines, and prove that the cosmic order had not been neglected under his reign. What better place to honour than Eridu, the city that tradition called the first, the city linked to the deep fresh water beneath the earth, the city whose god possessed wisdom older than kings. So while Ur accumulated wealth, administration, and dynastic prestige, Eridu may have become increasingly defined by something less measurable but equally durable: memory. Its greatness was no longer necessarily about population size. It was about sanctity. It was about the fact that the temple mound contained layer after layer of human devotion, stretching back farther than anyone could remember. Every rebuilding of the shrine reinforced the same message. This ground mattered. This was not just an old settlement. This was a place where the present touched an almost unimaginable past. And yet even sacred memory depends on the physical world. Eridu's identity was bound to water. Enki's power was bound to water. The city itself had been built beside wetlands, channels, and the shifting edge of the southern plain. What happens when that water begins to move away? When the water moved, Eridu's physical life may have changed. But something else was happening at the same time. The city was becoming harder to erase, not in mud brick. Mud brick collapses, walls melt back into the ground. Canals silt up, fields become salt-crusted or dry. A settlement can lose its harbour, its farmland, its population, and eventually its political importance. But a city can survive in stories, and Eridu survived in stories. The surviving texts come from long after Eridu's earliest days. That matters. A hymn copied by a Babylonian scribe is not a recording from the first farmers who built beside the marshes. A myth written down in the 2nd or 1st millennium BCE cannot simply be read as a direct report about life thousands of years earlier. But later texts tell us something equally important. They show how later Mesopotamians remembered Eridu. Again and again, Eridu appears as Enki's city, his sacred seat, the place linked to the Abzu, the freshwater deep, believed to lie beneath the earth. In Mesopotamian thought, this was not just water under the ground. The Abzu was a cosmic source. It was the hidden reservoir from which fertility, life, ritual purity, and divine wisdom could emerge. For people living between unpredictable rivers, that idea had enormous power. Water could save you, water could destroy you. Too little, and crops failed. Too much, and canals burst. Fields vanished, houses collapsed, and families fled. But fresh water, controlled and channeled, made civilization possible. It turned reed marshes and alluvial mud into fields of barley. It supported herds, gardens, workshops, boats, and cities. So when Mesopotamian priests imagined Enki ruling the deep sweet waters beneath the land, they were not imagining something abstract. They were imagining the force that made life possible in southern Iraq, and Eridu was placed at the centre of that imagination. In hymns the city could be praised as a radiant sacred place, a place of divine splendour and ordered ritual. In myths, Enki's connection to Eridu made the city a source of wisdom, craft, and the rules that held society together. Later traditions associated Enki with the Me, divine powers, or cultural principles that governed everything from kingship and temple offices to crafts, music, law, and social order. Think about what that means. Eridu was no longer simply one ancient settlement among many. It became a place where civilization itself could be imagined as having a beginning. Not necessarily a beginning in the archaeological sense. The people who wrote these texts were not excavators. They did not know about prehistoric pottery layers buried beneath a temple mound. They were not trying to reconstruct a timeline from carbon dates and settlement patterns. They were doing something different. They were creating sacred history. And sacred history does not ask only what happened first. It asks, what place has the right to stand at the beginning? For Mesopotamian scribes, ancient cities answered that question. A city with deep antiquity could give legitimacy to the present. Kings could claim they restored ancient temples. Priests could claim they preserved rituals handed down from remote generations. A dynasty might be new, a ruler might be a conqueror, a city might have risen only recently. But if it could connect itself to the old sacred centres, it could present its authority as part of the proper order of the universe. This was not just propaganda in the simple modern sense. People likely believed these connections mattered. If the gods had established order at the beginning of time, then maintaining old temples, reciting old hymns, and observing inherited rituals helped keep that order intact. Neglecting a sanctuary was dangerous. It was not merely poor administration, It could threaten the relationship between humans, gods, water, land, and kingship itself. Eridu's age gave it a special role in this system. It stood at the southern edge of the Mesopotamian world, near the marshes and the gulf, where land and water seemed to blur together. In cosmological geography, that position mattered. Eridu was close to the waters below, close to the waters beyond, close to the imagined origins of abundance. The real city had canals, reed beds, temples, houses, and people carrying out ordinary work. The literary Eridu became something larger, a threshold, a sacred source, a place where divine wisdom entered the human world. And before any scribe pressed a stylus into clay, these ideas may already have been moving through oral tradition. We cannot recover the exact words. Oral stories leave no direct archaeological layer. A tale told beside a shrine, on a boat, in a workshop, or during a festival can disappear without trace. But the repeated themes preserved in later texts suggest that memories of Eridu's sacred status were passed down for generations before they were fixed in writing. Stories change as they travel. They become sharper, stranger, more useful. A local shrine can become the home of a god. A remembered flood can become a world-changing disaster. An old settlement can become the first city, and each generation can reshape the past to explain its own present. That is why we have to separate two Eridus. There is the physical Eridu archaeologists investigate, a settlement founded in deep prehistory, rebuilt around a temple, altered by changing watercourses, and eventually reduced to a mound in the desert. Then there is Eridu in literature. That Eridu did not shrink when other cities grew. It expanded. The less central the city became in politics, perhaps the easier it was to place it at the beginning of everything. Uruk could be the great metropolis. Ur could be the royal power. Babylon could become the imperial centre. But Eridu could remain older than all of them. Older, deeper, closer to the source. That is the strange power of cultural memory. It does not preserve the past exactly as it was. It preserves what later people need the past to mean. And for Mesopotamia, Eridu meant that civilization had roots. Roots in freshwater, roots in ritual, roots in a city so ancient that even when its streets fell silent, its name still carried the sound of beginnings. But memory cannot fill a canal. It cannot bring boats back to a harbour. It cannot wash salt from a field. So, if Eridu was once built beside life-giving water, and today stands as a dry mound in the Iraqi desert, the obvious question is almost unavoidable. Did the water leave Eridu? In one sense, yes. But that simple answer hides a much more complicated story. Southern Mesopotamia was never a fixed landscape. It was a world made by moving water. The Tigris and Euphrates carried enormous loads of silt down from the mountains of Anatolia and Iran. Every flood deposited more mud. Every shifting channel created new banks, new marshes, new islands of higher ground, new places where people could farm or build. Over centuries, a river could migrate, a canal could clog, a shoreline could advance or retreat. Land that had once been close to the Gulf could become inland. A settlement that once had easy access to water could find itself stranded beside silting channels and exhausted fields. To live in southern Mesopotamia was to live on ground that was constantly being rewritten. And Eridu was especially vulnerable to that process, because its entire existence depended on water connections. Not just drinking water, not just irrigation, everything. Water meant fish from marshes, reeds for roofs, mats, baskets, and boats. Grazing land for animals, mud for bricks, canals for travel. River routes for trade, fields watered enough to grow barley and dates. Access to the Gulf and the wider networks that connected southern Mesopotamia to distant lands. Take away reliable water, and a city does not simply become less convenient. Its entire economic system begins to come apart. Imagine you are living at Eridu during its stronger periods. You can move goods by boat more easily than by land. A heavy load of grain, timber, stone, fish, wool, or pottery can travel along canals and rivers with far less effort than dragging it across mud and desert. Boats link households to fields, temples to storehouses, villages to cities, cities to the Gulf. Now imagine the channel begins to shallow. At first it is manageable. People clear silt, they repair banks, they dig new cuts. They redirect water. Mesopotamian communities had been managing water for generations. They were not passive victims waiting for nature to decide their fate. But maintaining canals takes labour. A canal network is like a living machine made of mud. Stop maintaining it, and it fills with sediment. Let one embankment fail, and water may escape into the wrong fields. Let floodwater stand too long, and crops rot. Let too little water reach a branch canal, and farms at the far end dry out. And then there was salt. Irrigation created the prosperity of southern Mesopotamia. Without it, much of the alluvial plain could not support dense populations. But irrigation also carried a hidden danger. River water contains dissolved salts. When water spreads across a field and evaporates under the fierce southern sun, much of that salt remains behind in the soil. Do that year after year, century after century, and the land can become harder to farm. Barley tolerates salt better than wheat, which may help explain why barley became so important in southern Mesopotamia. But even barley has limits. A field can be watered, planted, harvested, and still produce less each year, because the soil beneath it is slowly changing. Archaeologists and environmental historians have long argued about how large a role salinization played in the decline of different Mesopotamian settlements. The evidence is real. Ancient texts record crop patterns, irrigation problems, and changing agricultural conditions, while surveys reveal landscapes shaped by old canals and abandoned fields. But connecting that evidence directly to Eridu is difficult. We do not have a neat clay tablet saying, "The last farmers of Eridu left because their fields became too salty." Cities do not usually write their own obituary. What we have instead are clues, changes in settlement patterns, shifts in political importance, environmental reconstructions, abandoned channels, layers of sediment, the changing distribution of towns across the plain. These clues suggest that Eridu's water world did not remain stable forever. But they do not point to one dramatic day when a river turned away and everyone packed up. The Gulf shoreline moved over long periods too. In deep prehistory, the coastline lay differently than it does today. Rivers built land outward through sedimentation, while changes in sea level and local geography altered the relationship between marsh, river and sea. Eridu may once have stood much closer to waters connected to the Gulf than it does now. That possibility matters. A city near the meeting point of river channels, marshlands and maritime routes could become a powerful sacred and economic centre. But if coastlines shifted, channels silted, and traffic moved elsewhere, Eridu could lose advantages that had once seemed permanent. Trade may have followed the water, and when water routes changed, trade routes could change with them. Merchants and boatmen do not remain loyal to an old harbour because it has a glorious past. They go where the channels are deep enough, where goods can be loaded, where markets are active, where rulers can protect commerce, and where the journey still makes economic sense. That is one reason environmental explanations cannot stand alone. Eridu did not exist in an empty landscape. Other cities were growing. Uruk became a massive urban centre. Ur gained major importance near the Gulf routes. Political power, temple wealth, labour systems, warfare, royal investment, and trade networks all affected which cities expanded, and which cities became more peripheral. A shifting river could weaken Eridu, but a rising rival could weaken it too, and the two processes could reinforce each other. If a city loses water access, it becomes harder to support its population. If population declines, there are fewer workers to maintain canals. If canals deteriorate, farms suffer. If farms suffer, temple revenues shrink. If trade moves to another city, merchants, craftspeople, and officials may follow. Decline can become a chain reaction, not a single catastrophe. Not one final flood, not one drought, not one invading army, not one poisoned field. Eridu's transformation was probably slower, messier, and more human than that. Water may have moved, salt may have accumulated, channels may have filled. Trade may have shifted, political power certainly shifted. And through all of it, people adapted, repaired, relocated, rebuilt, and remembered. The water did not simply leave Eridu. The entire landscape around Eridu changed, and eventually the city that had stood so close to the imagined source of fresh water found itself surrounded by dry ground, silent canals, and the long aftermath of a world that had moved on. But what does it actually mean for a city to be abandoned? We imagine a final morning, doors closing, families loading carts, a last boat leaving a dying canal, then silence. That image is powerful. It is also usually wrong. Ancient cities rarely disappear in one clean moment. They shrink, they recover, they change neighbourhoods. People move from low ground to higher ground. A place that was once crowded with homes becomes a temple district. A city that once ruled becomes a provincial town. A harbour becomes a shrine. A shrine becomes a destination for pilgrims who no longer live nearby. And sometimes, after centuries of decline, people return. Not because the old city has regained its former power, but because ruins have a strange kind of gravity. They preserve ancestral claims, they hold gods, graves, old stories, and the visible remains of a world that still matters. Eridu seems to have followed something like this longer, slower pattern. Its greatest importance belonged to the deep past. Long before the kings of later Mesopotamian empires, before Uruk became the dominant urban force, Eridu had already accumulated centuries of building, rebuilding, and religious authority. Its temple mound was not just old, it was ancient even to many of the people who later came there. But age alone does not keep a city alive. As political power shifted across southern Mesopotamia, Eridu gradually lost the central position it may once have held. Uruk expanded into a major urban centre. Ur became increasingly important as a royal city and a hub connected to Gulf trade. Other cities controlled fields, canals, labour forces, and armies. The southern plain was not ruled from one permanent capital. It was a patchwork of competing centres, each trying to command water, grain, trade, and the loyalty of surrounding communities. In that kind of world, a city could remain sacred without remaining powerful. That distinction is crucial. Eridu may have retained enormous religious prestige because it was associated with Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, craft, and the deep waters beneath the earth. Later Mesopotamian traditions treated Eridu as a place of beginnings, a city tied to the first kings in the world before the flood. But sacred prestige does not necessarily mean a large resident population. A temple can outlive markets. A ritual can outlive a neighbourhood. Priests, pilgrims, officials, and local farmers may continue to visit a place long after its streets no longer carry the traffic they once did. Think of an old cathedral in a town that has moved away from it. The building still matters. People still know its name. Festivals may still be held there. Rulers may still make gifts to it, hoping to connect themselves with its ancient authority. But the economic centre of life has shifted somewhere else. That may be closer to Eridu's later history than the idea of a city suddenly erased from the map. Archaeology gives us traces of continued occupation and reuse, but not a simple, uninterrupted story. The mound contains evidence from many periods. Some areas were rebuilt. Others were left behind. Later, people inherited a landscape already filled with ruined walls, buried floors, old temple platforms, and memories far older than any individual could possibly understand. And that creates another problem. When archaeologists find fewer remains from a particular period, it can suggest population decline. But it does not automatically prove that nobody was there. People may have lived in lighter structures that left fewer traces. They may have shifted to another part of the mound. They may have occupied nearby settlements instead of the old centre. Or they may have visited seasonally for cult activity, grazing, fishing, trade, or pilgrimage. Absence of evidence is not a final goodbye. At the same time, we should not romanticize continuity. Eridu did not remain the city it had once been. Its political influence faded. Its regional role diminished. The systems that supported dense urban life, reliable water transport, agricultural surplus, labour mobilization, and temple wealth, were increasingly concentrated elsewhere. A city needs more than memory to stay large. It needs people. It needs food. It needs water. It needs routes worth travelling, and institutions strong enough to organise labour. If a canal silts up, a rival city attracts merchants, royal patronage goes elsewhere, and farms produce less, the city does not need to be destroyed to become smaller. It can simply become less necessary. That is one of history's quietest forces. Not conquest, not fire, not collapse, irrelevance. But even that word may be too harsh for Eridu. It became less central to the political and economic map of Mesopotamia. It did not become meaningless. In fact, its very distance from later power may have strengthened its symbolic role. Eridu could become the place everyone looked backward toward, the sacred first city at the edge of remembered time. Later texts preserved it. Ritual traditions honoured it. Kings invoked ancient places because ancient places gave their rule depth. To claim a connection to Eridu was to claim connection to origins themselves. So was Eridu abandoned. In the everyday sense, eventually, much of it was. Permanent large-scale urban life faded. Houses decayed. Canals failed or moved away. Wind-blown dust and sediment accumulated over abandoned walls. The city became a mound. But abandonment is not destruction. Destruction means a sudden violent event. Burning, demolition, massacre, conquest, perhaps an earthquake or flood. Burial means the physical covering of old buildings by mud brick collapse, flood deposits, dust, new construction and time. Historical obscurity means something different again. It means a place survives in fragments, in old names, broken bricks, religious memory and stories, whose details have become impossible to separate from myth. Eridu experienced aspects of all these processes across its immense history. Buildings collapsed and were covered. Water routes changed. Population declined. Political importance moved elsewhere. Its past was transformed into sacred memory. It was not erased in a day. It was slowly converted from a living city into an ancient one. And that is why the mound matters so much. Beneath its dry surface lies not the frozen remains of one lost civilization, but layer after layer of adaptation, people arriving, building, praying, moving, returning, and finally leaving behind a place too important to be forgotten, yet too changed to remain alive in the old way. And once a city becomes a mound, another transformation begins. The ruins stop looking like ruins. A mud brick wall collapses after rain. Its softened bricks melt into the same brown earth from which they were made. Roof beams rot away, plaster flakes off, rooms fill with wind-blown dust. A street becomes a shallow depression, then a faint line, then nothing visible at all. Give that process a few centuries, then a few thousand years, and an entire city can seem to vanish without ever being carried away. That is what happened at Eridu. Not in one dramatic burial, not one flood swallowing every house at once. The city was covered by the ordinary, relentless forces that erase mud brick architecture across Mesopotamia. Walls fell. New walls were built over old ones. Temples were enlarged, repaired, and raised on platforms. Floors were buried beneath later floors. Refuse accumulated. Sediment moved across the plain. Dust settled season after season. Mud brick is one of humanity's oldest building materials. It is cheap, practical, and perfectly suited to a land with abundant clay but limited stone and timber. But it has a strange afterlife. Stone ruins can stand for centuries, announcing themselves from the landscape. Mud brick ruins tend to return to earth. The city literally became the hill it stood on. Archaeologists call these artificial settlement mounds tells. They are not natural hills, even if they can look that way from a distance. Each layer is the compressed record of human activity: collapsed walls, ash from hearths, broken pottery, food remains, drains, courtyards, temple foundations, rebuilding episodes, and soil carried in by wind and water. At Eridu, that process created a mound rising above the surrounding plain. What had once been streets, houses, shrines, and public spaces became an elevated mass of earth and debris. From the outside it could look almost empty, but inside that mound are thousands of years of decisions. Where to build, where to worship, how to move water, how to survive in a changing landscape. And the landscape around Eridu changed too. Today the site stands in a dry region of southern Iraq, far from the active coastline of the Persian Gulf. But when Eridu was first settled, the relationship between land, marsh, river channels, and sea was very different. The Gulf shoreline lay farther inland than it does now. Rivers shifted, channels silted up, marshes expanded and contracted. Sediment carried down from the Tigris and Euphrates slowly built new land outward into the Gulf. This is one of the great geological facts of southern Mesopotamia. The ground itself was moving, not quickly enough for one person to notice, but fast enough to reshape the fate of cities over generations. A harbour can become a marsh can become farmland, a canal can become a dry scar in the desert, and a city built around water can find itself stranded in a landscape that no longer works the way it once did. But buried did not mean forgotten. Eridu survived in memory long after its days as a major living centre had passed. Ancient Mesopotamian texts preserved its name. Often informed scholars connect with the site known today as Tel Abu Sharin. Later traditions remembered Eridu as the city of Enki, lord of the freshwater deep. The Sumerian King List placed kingship there before the flood. Ritual texts, myths, and royal inscriptions continue to invoke it as a place of enormous antiquity. Now, that does not mean every later story gives us a precise historical report. It doesn't. A city remembered as the first city in the world has already crossed from history into sacred imagination. But memory can preserve something real even when details become mythic. The name remained. The religious association remained. The idea that somewhere in the southern plain stood a place older than ordinary history remained. Local knowledge mattered too. Long before archaeologists began mapping every mound with surveys and satellite data, people living in the region knew these rises in the landscape were not random. They had names. They produced ancient bricks, pottery fragments, and traces of old construction. They stood above the flat terrain like islands from another age. When 19th century explorers and later archaeological teams began investigating southern Iraq, they did not discover a completely unknown world. They entered a landscape already marked by remembered places, old names, and ruins visible to those who knew how to read them. The identification of Eridu at Tel Abu Sharain emerged from that meeting between texts, geography, local tradition, and excavation. Archaeologists found the massive temple mound, inscriptions and artifacts connected to the cult of Enki, and occupation layers reaching deep into the prehistoric Ubaid-period. The lost city had not been found intact. It had been recognized, but recognition is not the same as recovery. Much of Eridu still lies unexcavated beneath the mound. Archaeology is necessarily selective. Every trench reveals one narrow window into the past, while cutting through layers that cannot simply be put back exactly as they were. Excavators have uncovered important temple sequences and parts of the settlement, but they have not opened the entire city. No one has walked every street. No one has found every house. No one can yet say with certainty how all parts of Eridu changed through every phase of its long history. There may be workshops still buried there, storage areas, domestic neighborhoods, canal edges, burials, archives made from clay tablets, if any survived in places still untouched. Or there may be evidence that overturns assumptions archaeologists have repeated for decades. That is the danger and the excitement of ancient history. The mound always knows more than we do. Modern archaeology is also no longer limited to digging downward. Researchers can study vanished landscapes from above and from far away. Satellite imagery can reveal traces of ancient river channels, canals, field systems, and settlement patterns that are almost invisible on the ground. A dried channel may appear as a subtle colour difference in the soil. Buried walls can affect vegetation or moisture. Old waterways can be mapped across enormous areas, showing how cities like Eridu were connected to marshes, rivers, and neighbouring communities. Environmental studies add another layer. Soil cores can preserve pollen, shells, salts, reeds, and microscopic remains that help reconstruct ancient wetlands. Sediment can reveal whether water was fresh, brackish, seasonal, or increasingly unreliable. Animal bones and plant remains can show what people ate, what they raised, what they imported, and how they adapted as the southern plain changed around them. In other words, archaeologists are not just excavating a city. They are reconstructing an entire world that no longer exists. But this work has never been simple in Iraq. War, invasion, sanctions, political instability, and periods of restricted access have interrupted archaeological research for decades. Sites across southern Iraq have faced looting, damage, and neglect. When ancient objects are removed from their original context, they lose much of the information that makes them historically useful. A tablet sold on the antiquities market may still carry writing. A seal may still be beautiful, but without knowing exactly where it was found, beside what objects, in what layer, inside what building, part of its story is gone. Looting does not just steal artifacts, it steals questions we may never be able to ask again. Even preservation creates difficult choices. Excavated mud brick deteriorates quickly when exposed to rain, wind, salt, and temperature changes. Sometimes leaving a structure buried is safer than uncovering it. Sometimes protecting a site requires fences, guards, documentation, conservation work, and long-term funding that are difficult to sustain. So Eridu remains both revealed and hidden, a city visible as a mound, a sacred name preserved in texts, a landscape reconstructed from soil, satellite images, and ancient channels. A place damaged by time, but not defeated by it. And every new discovery has the power to change the story. A canal dated more precisely a temple layer reinterpreted. A pollen sample showing a wetter environment than expected. A survey revealing settlements once connected to Eridu. Any one of these can force archaeologists to reconsider how the city grew, how it declined, and what role it truly played at the beginning of Mesopotamian civilization. That is why Eridu was never fully lost. It disappeared from daily life. Its walls dissolved, its waters moved away. Its political power faded into the shadow of later cities. But beneath the dust, beneath the broken brick, beneath the stories that transformed it into the city before the flood, Eridu remained, not waiting like a perfect time capsule, waiting like history itself, fragmented, buried, incomplete, and still capable of changing everything we think we know about where civilization began. And that brings us back to the question that has been sitting beneath this entire story. Was Eridu really the first city? The honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. If by first city we mean the first place anywhere on Earth where human beings lived in large, organized settlements, then Eridu cannot carry that title alone. Complex communities were emerging in different ways across the ancient world. In Anatolia, people had built dense settlements thousands of years earlier. In the Levant, farming villages had grown into permanent communities. Along the Nile, in the Indus region, in the Yellow River valleys of China, and eventually in the Americas, people would create their own systems of agriculture, ritual, trade, hierarchy, and urban life. Civilization did not switch on in one place, on one morning, because one king built one wall. Human societies had been experimenting for millennia. But Eridu matters because it reveals a particular path into civilization. A southern Mesopotamian path, one built not simply on grain fields, but on wetlands, on fishing grounds, reed beds, canal edges, seasonal water, mud brick, shared labour, and a temple that kept rising, generation after generation, above the accumulated remains of the people below. That is a very different origin story from the one we are often told. The usual version begins with writing. A clay tablet appears. Someone records grain, beer, sheep, workers, land. History begins because words become visible, or it begins with kings. A ruler takes power. Armies march, walls go up, taxes are collected. A state is born. Those things matter. Writing transformed what institutions could remember. Kingship transformed how power could be organized and justified. But at Eridu, the foundations were already being laid long before the earliest known writing systems, and long before the kinds of rulers later texts would celebrate. People had to learn how to live together first. They had to coordinate work in a difficult landscape. They had to manage water without fully controlling it. They had to build homes that could be rebuilt after rain, flood, decay, and time. They had to create trust beyond a single household. They had to decide which place mattered enough to repair, enlarge, and return to over centuries. And they had to make memory physical. That may be the deepest lesson of Eridu. A temple is not just a building. It is a claim that this place will outlast the people currently living in it. Every rebuilt platform says, what happened here before us still matters. Every offering, every repaired wall, every new floor laid above an old one creates a connection between the living and the dead. Over time, that connection can become powerful enough to organize a whole community. Maybe that is why later Mesopotamians remembered Eridu not merely as an old settlement, but as the beginning. It was associated with Enki, the god of freshwater, wisdom, craft, and the hidden depths beneath the earth. It was placed at the start of the Sumerian King List, before the flood, before ordinary dynasties, before the familiar sequence of human history. Archaeology cannot confirm that kingship literally descended from heaven at Eridu, It cannot identify a single first king ruling a city before a world-destroying flood. Those are claims from later literary and religious traditions shaped by the needs of the societies that wrote them. But archaeology does show something remarkable. At the site identified as Eridu, communities repeatedly built and rebuilt a sacred centre across a very long period. The settlement was part of a wider network of Ubaid communities. It was not alone. It did not emerge from emptiness. Yet its scale, longevity, temple sequence, and later cultural importance gave it an unusual place in Mesopotamian memory. That tension is impossible to escape. The evidence tells us one story: gradual development, incomplete remains, changing waterways, connected settlements, and no clean line between village and city. The myths tell another. Eridu, as the first city, the city of the deep waters, the place where order began before the flood washed the old world away. Neither story should simply erase the other. Myth is not an excavation report. But it can reveal what later people believed was worth remembering. It tells us which places carried authority, which landscapes felt sacred, which ruins seemed so ancient that they belonged to a time before time. And Eridu forces us to see civilization less as an invention and more as an accumulation. Not one breakthrough, but thousands. A family deciding to stay through another season, a community digging or maintaining a watercourse, a builder laying mud brick over an older foundation, a ritual repeated until no one remembers when it began, a settlement becoming a sacred place becoming a city becoming a mound, then a mound becoming a memory. That pattern was not unique to southern Mesopotamia. Across the ancient world, complex societies emerged through their own combinations of environment, belief, exchange, labour, and inherited knowledge. There were many beginnings, many experiments, many places where human beings learned to organise lives at scales their ancestors had never known. But Eridu may preserve one of the earliest and most haunting examples of what happens when a community decides that its past must remain present. Because in the end a city does not survive only through walls. Walls collapse, canals dry, kings disappear, even writing can break, scatter and fall silent. A city survives when people continue to tell each other that it mattered. And if Eridu could remain alive in temple ritual, king lists, flood stories, sacred geography, and the imagination of people living thousands of years after its decline, then maybe the final question is not whether Eridu was the first city. Maybe it is this: what does it mean for a city to survive after no one lives there anymore? Maybe it means survival is not what we think it is. Maybe a city does not have to remain inhabited to keep shaping the world. Eridu began as an Ubaid settlement on the edge of a changing wetland world. Not a city in the later sense, not yet a place of written administration, palace bureaucracy, monumental walls, or armies marching under royal banners. It was a community of people learning how to live where land and water kept rewriting each other. They fished. They gathered reeds. They farmed where farming was possible. They built with mud brick, repaired what weather destroyed, and returned to the same ground again and again. Then, over generations, something accumulated. Not just houses. Not just pottery, tools, bones, and broken walls. Meaning, the temple rose. Then it rose again and again. Each new building covered the remains of an older one, turning memory into architecture. What may have begun as a local sacred structure became the centre of a place that later Mesopotamians treated as older than ordinary history itself. That is why Eridu became more than a settlement. It became a beginning. Later tradition connected it to Enki, lord of the freshwater deep, wisdom, craft, and the life-giving waters beneath the earth. The Sumerian King List placed Eridu at the start of kingship before the flood, before the long chain of rulers and rival cities that filled Mesopotamian history. In those texts, kingship descends from heaven, and Eridu receives it first. We should be careful with that claim. Archaeology cannot prove that the first king ruled at Eridu. It cannot show us a moment when civilization arrived, fully formed like a lightning strike from the sky, and it cannot establish with total certainty that Eridu was the first city humans ever built. The evidence is too fragmentary, the definition of a city is too complicated, and ancient people in many regions were building permanent, complex communities through their own paths long before cities looked like the cities we recognize. But Eridu's claim still matters. It matters because it was ancient even to the ancient Mesopotamians. It mattered because generations of people looked at this place and saw origins. They saw the sacred source of urban life, political order, and knowledge itself. Whether or not Eridu was literally first, it became the city against which the idea of firstness was measured, and there is something almost perfect about the way it ended. Eridu was not simply erased, it was not swallowed in one night by a single flood, buried beneath sand and forgotten forever. Its decline was slower, messier, and more human than that. Waterways shifted, shorelines changed, nearby powers rose. Trade routes moved. Ur became a major centre. The old sacred city lost the conditions that had once made it central. Its buildings collapsed. Mudbrick melted back into mud. Wind carried dust across abandoned walls. Rain softened the edges of platforms that had once stood above the marshes. And slowly the city became a mound. But even as the physical place faded, Eridu was absorbed into everything around it, into the landscape, into religious tradition, into stories of the flood, into the memory of Enki, into king lists copied by scribes who lived thousands of years after the earliest people at the site had disappeared. That is not erasure, that is transformation. The city became earth. The earth became sacred geography became myth, and myth carried the name of Eridu forward into worlds its first inhabitants could never have imagined. Today, beneath that mound, there are still questions waiting. How much of the earliest settlement remains hidden below later construction? How exactly did its people manage the wetlands around them? What did the shifting waters look like in the centuries when Eridu was growing? How many settlements, channels, fields, and seasonal camps have vanished beneath the changing geography of southern Mesopotamia? We are still searching for the shoreline that made Eridu possible, still trying to separate remembered flood from real flood events, still tracing the buried networks that connected temple, household, marsh, canal, and field. And with every new survey, every satellite image, every excavation, the map of early Mesopotamia becomes a little less certain and a little more alive. Because Eridu is not just the story of a lost city. It is the story of human beings discovering that a place can outlive them, that shared work can become ritual, that ritual can become authority, that authority can become history, and that history, even after the walls are gone, can become a beginning. If you enjoyed this journey into Eridu, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is waiting for you in the description.